Bom dia a todos. Good morning. Nós já vamos começar, então peço gentilmente que todos os convidados tomem seus assentos. I would like to kindly ask to everyone take your seats. We are about to start. Thank you. Obrigada.
O Brasil é a nossa fonte de inspiração. Acreditamos no poder transformador das histórias, contadas todos os dias, de norte a sul do país. Somos curiosos, nos aprofundamos nos temas. E a consistência ao longo de décadas nos deu a autoridade reconhecida pela audiência. Ajudamos a fazer as perguntas certas, com inteligência e conteúdo de alto nível. Vamos além das notícias para chegar à intimidade de cada história e inspiramos as tomadas de decisão. Da saúde dos filhos ao futuro do planeta. Das pequenas compras às grandes aquisições. Do agronegócio à gastronomia. Das tendências da moda aos clássicos da decoração. Das tecnologias do dia a dia às grandes inovações. Da escolha do candidato ao seu próximo carro, de onde investir a como empreender. Traduzimos a complexidade de um mundo em transformação. Nosso propósito é conectar pessoas e histórias, informando, educando, entretendo, debatendo. Ouvindo e nos transformando com o nosso público. Reconhecemos os talentos e celebramos suas conquistas. Criamos experiências únicas. Antecipamos tendências e refletimos a diversidade cultural do nosso país. Nossa paixão pela comunicação, a inquietude criativa, o pioneirismo, o inegociável compromisso do jornalismo com o fortalecimento da democracia e a busca incansável pela qualidade nos levam à liderança. Acreditamos na interdependência da sociedade e das instituições e que cidadãos inspirados e bem informados têm poder para construir um país melhor. Trabalhamos com entusiasmo e disciplina e mudamos constantemente para permanecermos fiéis à nossa essência e ao espírito criador dos nossos fundadores.
Em 2025, o mundo estará com os olhos voltados para o Brasil. A COP30, que acontecerá em Belém, no coração da Amazônia, oferece uma oportunidade valiosa para as empresas promoverem negócios, expandirem suas conexões e reafirmarem seu compromisso com a sustentabilidade. Para aproveitar ao máximo as oportunidades da realização no Brasil da maior conferência global sobre mudanças climáticas, apresentamos o projeto Amcham COP30, que inclui uma série de ações estratégicas para os nossos associados. As empresas participantes terão a chance de se envolver ativamente na COP30, aumentar a visibilidade para os seus projetos de sustentabilidade e se conectar com representantes empresariais e autoridades. Além disso, contribuirão para deixar um legado social e ambiental duradouro para o Brasil. Prepare-se e participe das principais discussões que acontecerão ao longo do ano em nosso Fórum Pré-COP. Junte-se à nossa missão empresarial, que visitará projetos de referência em sustentabilidade na Amazônia e esteja ao lado dos principais líderes de empresas e governos em nosso encontro empresarial durante a COP30 em Belém. Destaque a liderança da sua empresa, dando visibilidade aos seus projetos de sustentabilidade através da nossa plataforma de cases empresariais, com divulgação no Brasil e no exterior, além de uma série especial de webinários com grande alcance empresarial. Contribua para o desenvolvimento social e ambiental do Brasil, capacitando seus fornecedores e parceiros em temas de sustentabilidade como o nosso programa de capacitação Net Zero e apoie o nosso projeto social, que ensinará inglês a trabalhadores e jovens em situação de vulnerabilidade no Pará. Convidamos a sua empresa a se juntar a nós nesta jornada transformadora. Amcham Liga. Se liga!
Liderar uma transição energética justa é produzir a energia que o Brasil precisa hoje, mas já pensando no mundo de amanhã, com produtos mais sustentáveis, ajudando a cuidar das florestas, abrindo novas fronteiras. Transição energética justa. Isso é bom para todo mundo.
É nessa energia que a Petrobras vai.
Petrobras. O Brasil é a nossa energia. Brasil, união e reconstrução.
Senhoras e senhores, bom dia.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here at the Climate Week in this vibrant city that always is so welcoming to us. Please be welcome to this summit 2024, which is sponsored by Valor Econômico as part of celebration of the 25 years of this newspaper that will be next upcoming year, and the diplomatic relationships between Brazil and the USA this year. I would like to thank especially the sponsors of the seminar, Petrobras, Scala Data Center, JBS, Banco do Brasil, and sponsorship of Embratur, the support of the government of the state of Rio de Janeiro, Sebraban, Apex Brazil, and the Ministry of Development, Industry, Commerce, and Services of Brazil, as well as institutional support of I am Maria Fernanda Delmas. I am editor-in-chief of Valor Econômico. I will be hosting this meeting, which is very important for in times of global transformation without precedents. Climate change is not a far threat anymore. It cannot be object of discussion anymore just by specialists. They're knocking at our doors and interfering with our lives, even health. We can't just talk about sustainability anymore. The word that we even hear from experts, entrepreneurs, and executives is regeneration is not more enough. Interrupt climate change. We need to heal the planet. That means in practice that we need to keep progressing at the same time that we restore its balance. It's a huge challenge without magic, quick or simple solutions. It's a process that requires coordinated actions between public powers, civil society, and companies, and also between countries like Brazil and the United States. Besides regeneration, we need to understand the value of transition. That word, energy transition, we're going to be discussing that today. I invite each one of you to engage in discussions that will be performed here. And now I would like to invite to the stage Marcelo Marangon, President of the Managing Council of Amcham Brasil, to make his remarks. You have the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. On behalf of Amcham Brasil, it is an honor to welcome our guests here, the ones present here in the emblematic UN headquarters in New York, as well as those that are following us online. I would like also to express our thanks to Valor Econômico and Fred Cachar, member of our council, Maria Fernanda Delmas, as well as the UN Global Pact Brazil Network, represented here by Carlo Pereira, and the president of the Managing Council, Rachel Maia, as well as our sponsors, associates, and partners present here. This summit is an important to discuss energy transition that's fighting climate change, and an essential role that Brazil and the United States have and can have in this global effort. We know that transition for a low-carbon economy requires expressive or great investment. We estimate that about $4.5 trillion per annum will be necessary for the world to reach carbon neutrality based on clean and renewables energy, more than an urgent environment moved by innovation, entrepreneurship, and sustainable investments in green jobs. Brazil and the United States will contribute to accelerate a new and promising chapter in the bilateral relations, and that's exactly over this convergence that we want to talk about, the opportunity that Brazil and the United States solutions for the world, driving global development and ensuring a better future for the next generations. Thank you very much. This is the house of diplomacy, of negotiations, and for us, stage. Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I would like to thank you very much for your presence. A lot of people came direct from Brazil for these events. What happens when we started calling Climate Week? Actually, we call it the General Assembly Week. Those of us who are a little older, especially in this agenda, and a very full week or 2 weeks. Always an article in the New York Times 5 or 6 years ago. Brazil has a responsibility as a unique power, as I was saying at the year of the UNCC, at the climate principles, but even talking about officiality. So I see here, we see everything that we're going through. Now we're talking about the all the burning fields in Rio Grande do Sul. But I was saying what was going on relating the subtropical cyclones and the drought that was there. So I see this with a lot of, not only as with great sadness, but also as an opportunity. But that will not happen. We will not take advantage of that if we're not together. And that's when I said public powers and private sector as well as civil society, because this is not just an issue of technological innovation or development, but it's an issue of also changing regulations together, internally, externally, make that Brazil have the protagonism it deserves. Thank you. Thank you very much, Carlos. Now we're going to hear Mauricio Thomas Kim, Executive Director of Sustainability and Energetic Transition Petrobras, and a specialist that follows this a long time, has been following this for a long time. Welcome, Mauricio. Thank you very much. No, it's not that. Yeah. Energetic transition the world needs in order to fight climate change has a huge dimension. And to get to 1.5 centigrade which is what is necessary so that we don't have a big impact. We have some estimates that emissions should drop at a rhythm of 7% per year. To give you an idea, 7% reduction in emissions is what happened during COVID. So COVID, we would need a COVID effect every year in order to meet the goal. And that's where we see the huge scope of this challenge. Of course, that reduction cannot be with the impacts that COVID had over economies and society. So we are talking about an unprecedented transition that our societies had never lived through, which will have implications. Geopolitical competitive consequences in over countries and companies. So it's a very relevant dialogue. So it is a pleasure to participate in this event that involves exactly two great nations of the Americas with a lot of space to trace a cooperation even wider than one that already exists. All societies benefit from a transition involving the collaboration between more developed and less developed countries or markets. Collaboration allows a lower transition cost for everybody, and partner plurality reduces the dependence of a few countries of some elements that are part of this transition. As was already said, a country such as Brazil that is democratic, that has one of the most renewable matrices within the G20 and an excellent edge in cost when compared both in renewable molecules and electric, has all the conditions, and it should deepen commercial partnerships with the United States and with the world as a whole. And I have no doubt that this will bring benefits to both nations. That benefit of this cooperation between Brazil and the United States, as well as with other developed nations, brings benefits to both parties. Of course, for Brazil, attracting investments both in electrodes and renewable molecules, as well as the supply chain of production of these electrodes and molecules. On the other hand, for our partners, they will be able to access one of the low-cost, energetic, renewable matrices, as well as a development chain that, if encouraged in Brazil, will allow more security to our partners in terms of supply, which is known as nearshoring. In sum, this international cooperation in the energy transition promotes sustainable development, reducing costs and risks for all parties involved. We know that this transition involves the modification of primary energy sources. In that sense, Brazil is very well positioned because we already have 50% of our renewable energy matrix, and the world at large is just 15%. And when you look at the generation of electric energy, 90% is renewable, while around the world is only 30%. If we look at transportation, we already have 35% of molecules that make renewable transportation move. And Petrobras, as a great agent in energy production is completely open to this cooperation that I think is not just a cooperation among nations, but I would say it is especially between companies of those countries. At Petrobras, we have been doing a long-term project to reduce our carbon footprint. We have already reduced over 40% of our absolute emissions of greenhouse gases, and we reduced 50% the emissions due to methane emissions. Just to give you an idea, that will be 3 times domestic generation. So now we are going in very hard in new products, producing products with low carbon content, and to that end, the budget has already been approved of $11.5 billion. So to conclude, I would like to say that I am very excited with the partnership perspectives and technological advances that an event like this could harbor, and I wish to everybody a good session. Thank you very much. Thanks, Mauricio.
Scala Data Centers, headquartered in Brazil and supported by DigitalBridge, is the leading sustainable data center platform in Latin America's hyperscale market. Data centers are the critical hubs where nearly all data physically travels through, housing the cloud, the internet, and the AI. Scala exceeds the growing demand for digital infrastructure with high availability. Leveraging Brazil's 89% renewable energy matrix, Scala supports high-density artificial intelligence workloads. We're committed to decarbonization and the efficient use of energy and water. Our data centers are 100% powered by renewable and certified energy and carbon neutral from day one. We're deeply dedicated to local communities, actively creating jobs and offering training programs that foster sustainable and long-term growth.
A JBS nasceu há 70 anos no interior do Brasil e foi alimentando o sonho de ser uma empresa de alimentos global que hoje a JBS é uma das maiores empresas do mundo. Mas suas raízes estão aqui, onde alimenta crescimento e empregos, alimenta tecnologia e sustentabilidade. Alimenta o Brasil. Alimenta você. JBS, alimentando o que alimenta o mundo.
Iniciando nossas discussões de hoje.
We're going to start our discussions today with a very relevant talk about what brings us here. The theme is why is so critical energy transition. Daniela Chiaretti will mediate. Special reporter of Valor Econômico. You have the stage. Good morning. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here with you, here at the UN, to talk about this subject. I would like to, before I start our discussion, remind you that the UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres says that you can negotiate with nature, and also would like to say that Brazil is going through a very difficult experience this year with the impact of very strong natural events. We started with a great proportion, a big disaster in Rio Grande do Sul, and today we live this emergency climate situation with fires in 20 of the 27 states in the Federation. Only 2, according to Minister Marina Silva, are not victims of floods or fires. So this is very strategical. It's strategical for us. So why is the energy transition so critical? I have now the pleasure to call to the stage Caroline Kissing, specialist in geopolitics at New York University, or at David Baldwin, president of Goldwyn Strategy and also energy consultant for the Atlantic Council. I also have the pleasure to call the analyst Thomas Roland Rees, who is Bloomberg Head of North America Research. And again, Mauricio Maquin, Executive Director for transition, energy transition and sustainability of Petrobras. I'm going to ask the questions in Portuguese. Please, if there's any translation problem or any translation issues, you can let me know. Thank you. So I'm going to start with David. David, I would like to ask you, the theme of our debate is why transition is so critical. So I would like you to talk to us a little bit briefly. Why is it so critical?
Well, thanks for the question. It's a pleasure to be here and with such distinguished panelists as well. I'm also with the Atlantic Council. It's a think tank in Washington. It's got about 300 people. We've had a relationship with Brazil since the founding of the Latin America Center in 2013, and really looking forward to a closer relationship in the run-up to COP30. I think there are three reasons why the energy transition is critical. One is existential, as you referenced. You know, both in the environmental consequences are dire. Fires in Brazil, in Bolivia, flooding in Europe, fires and flooding in the United States. The second is really geopolitical, which is that, you know, if you think migration from Venezuela was bad over democracy, I mean, climate migration, the uninhabitability of places that we are seeing from hotspots, incredible heat, 100 degrees in Pakistan, 100 degrees in the Middle East, could be serious, and you're talking about civil unrest and serious economic dislocation, I think, from climate migration as well as scarcity of water. So those are two dire drivers, but the third really is opportunity, which is if we can come up with a tremendous price signal, more than voluntary commitments and 2050 targets, and we can get a real price signal from carbon markets or from frankly, insurance mandates or standards, then you're talking about a transformation of the global economy. And that's really a tremendous opportunity for jobs, and for Brazil, very uniquely, which has, you know, the ability to have excess green energy to make green hydrogen, something which we don't really have in the United States so much. It's a great opportunity, but there's a lot of policy work to be done to get from here to there.
Thank you. Obrigada. Tom, thank you for being there. And há poucos dias,
a few days ago, Bloomberg gave the news of that big oil companies were selling assets. How to understand that? Are they moving away from fossil fuels? And another question I'd like to ask you is if you can detail for us a little bit how this market is moving.
So, I mean, one of the things we look at is both what oil companies are stopping to invest in and what they're starting to invest in. So these numbers are not precise because I just read the report and looked at the chart to pull them, but it's something like $20 billion this year of assets sold by oil companies, predominantly in their core business. Actually, a small fraction of that was also them selling some of their green assets, which is maybe a trend we can speak about in a moment. And then overall, around $30 billion of investment into new energy areas. And the trend we've seen changing there in terms of oil companies' investment into new energies is maybe less investment into renewable electrons, wind and solar, and more into greener molecules. So, you know, taking those two numbers, $20 billion of divestment away from fossil fuels, $30 billion of investment into renewable energies, yes, you see a transition happening, but their overall investment, and we're not talking all oil companies here, I'm talking maybe the top 7 or 8 international oil companies, it was something like $180 billion of CapEx investment into their core business of oil. So they're still oil companies, and there is this transition happening on the side. But I mean, a few thoughts on that is divestment of their oil assets is not the big win for the environment that we might think it is, because they're just selling it to someone else who's going to be producing oil. And the question of, you know, investing into greener areas, I think that is a good thing, because oil companies do have a lot of capital to invest. But I think that we have to also consider where it's being directed. I mean, investing into wind and solar, it's nice because these are the areas of the energy transition that the purists like, because there's no downside. But those are, in the big scheme of things, battles that are already being won. I'd say that's jumping on a bandwagon. Actually, I welcome when they're investing into the areas that are more aligned with their core business, you know, the green molecules, some of which are a little bit more ambiguous from the point of view of public reputation, but it's the dirty work that needs to be done. Because ultimately, you know, we can talk about oil a little bit. I somewhat find myself, despite me being an analyst that focuses on the energy transition, somewhat defend oil companies and the production of oil. Because, you know, if, say, an oil company in the US produced less oil, then OPEC would produce more oil. There's the amount that individual companies produce is not what's going to reduce oil demand. It's the actual demand that has to reduce. There is already a coalition of oil-producing nations that club together and agree to reduce their output, and that's called OPEC, and it's done for price fixing. So that is not the answer, is having some kind of collective agreement to wind down production, although I'm sure oil companies would love that because it would mean very high prices and massive profits.
Muito obrigada. Thank you.
Thomas King, I'm going to go straight to you, using even the hooks of what Tom was mentioning. I'm going straight to a very polemic question. There is a very big debate in Brazil right now. I would like to know a little bit, how do you see that, and how do you see this investment that demand of oil, for oil, could drop in the future? Thank you very much. An important question. Oh, when you talk about energy transition, implicitly that means get out from fossil fuels into low carbon fuels. So the idea is that in the future there will be less consumption of fossil fuels. In that regard, firstly, Brazil is very well positioned vis-a-vis the rest of the world, as I had stated, as we already have a very renewable energy matrix, a very renewable electric matrix. We have also a very renewable transportation matrix. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do more for energy transition, and we have the means. The issue of your question is in this future in which there will be a smaller demand for oil, what are the measures that oil-producing companies can take? When I talk about smaller demand, that demand is not going to be zero. The scenarios of the International Energy Agency considers that if countries follow the Paris agreements, we will have a demand of about 60 million barrels a day of oil by 2060. Today, that demand is about 100 million a year. That would, we're talking about 60 billion million to meet the 1.5 centigrade goal. If we're talking about a net zero, that would, we're talking about 25 million barrels a day is what we should have in order to keep that 1.5 goal. So oil will be consumed and somebody will have to produce it. And then we have the discussion of who should produce that oil. And that's where we can number several criteria. I'm going to say something off the top of my head, improvising here. First, I think that, of course, there's a economic or financial criterion. So if you have cheaper oil, there is an edge there. But maybe that is not the main, but only one of them. Because if you, in order to produce that oil, if you emit a lot more than somebody else or another producer, maybe your oil will have a preference. So the carbon footprint that is in this oil production should be one of the criteria. Today you pay differently if you have light or heavy oil, but you don't pay, that's not valued differently in the market if that oil emitted more or less to be produced. The third factor, it's an equity factor. We have developed countries that since the pre-industrial era are the great guilty parties for all the emissions, and we have new people coming to this party or countries where oil is an important element to leverage resources for their economies, even to do the energy transition. So the output of this oil or the exit of this oil shouldn't be done the same way. It's not equal responsibility for our countries. And if I could insert a fourth element, is that this income obtained by those few countries in oil, or the few producers that will remain in the market, that should be partly destined for energy transition. So it's important, and that's where I would like to briefly talk about what Thomas mentioned. If the great issue to lower oil consumption is on the demand side, not on the offer side. And I will say one thing more. Let's suppose, absurdly, Brazil made the decision to not produce any more oil. You know what's going to happen to the climate? It could actually go up, because possibly one producer that emits more would take Brazil's place. Brazil will be abdicating that revenue. The Brazilian people would be abdicating of an important part of the resources that used for their development and its social policies. Maybe the incentive policies that are graded to biofuels, biomethane, these are incentives that wouldn't be done anymore because there wouldn't be a channel for that, and climate wouldn't change a iota because another producer will be producing that same oil. So I think that this discussion has to be a deeper discussion, taking into account these factors that I mentioned. Thank you very much, Thomas King.
I'd like to hear you, Caroline. I left you for last because I wanted to hear your vision, the vision of a researcher and someone who's a specialist in geopolitics. You are with NYU. If you could build on what Thomas said. In other words, who will occupy the carbon space? This was just building on what Thomas says. And since it's 2 months before the COP in Baku, which will discuss financing, I wanted to ask you about the new number. There'll be a new number to decarbonize the global economy, to help the companies to adapt and to help those countries who have suffered the most. There was the number of $100 billion that was mentioned. So now they're talking about the numbers of over $1 trillion. What do you see? Do you think there are enough resources in the world for all of this?
Thanks so much. Thank you for that excellent question. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here, and it's a fantastic panel. I have to say, as everyone was speaking, I was kind of nodding my head in agreement. So it's, and welcome to New York. I'm a native New Yorker, so this is always a very exciting time to kind of open up New York doors to the world. You know, I think what has already been said, I mean, to David's points about why the energy transition is so critical, you have it from, this is about economic modernization, it's competitiveness, it's also the urgency, the existential threat, the climate impacts are enormous that, you know, are being felt around the world. And at the same time, the world uses a tremendous amount of energy. And that energy is very important for competitiveness. And to the point of demand, you know, the world is still using 100+ million barrels of oil a day. Natural gas production and consumption is on the rise. So to kind of go back then to a year ago, as you asked about the upcoming COP29 that's happening in Baku, Azerbaijan, you know, COP28, one of the big sort of seminal headlines that came out of the UAE was the for the first time actually in 28 Conference of Parties to transition away from fossil fuels. However, the reality of transitioning away from fossil fuels is not going to happen tomorrow. As you know, as was already pointed out in this panel, the world continues to use, the developing world is using more hydrocarbons. You see even consumption of coal demand. Even, I mean, it seems like such a contradiction in places that are experiencing some extraordinary extreme heat. Because of that extreme heat, you have much more demand for cooling. And where is the power for that cooling coming from? In places like Pakistan, in places like Bangladesh, India, and China, you know, the go-to is coal. So I think it's very complex. I think there's a massive issue around finance that, you know, you asked about the 100 billion. You know, I'm sitting here as, you know, I'm born and raised in the United States. You know, we're not a, we have not met all of our commitments to climate finance. I think it's a really problematic space. Even last year, I think what was put forward for climate finance really in the scheme of what is required, it's a drop in the bucket, right? If you also go to South Africa and you looked at South Africa in COP27, that South Africa was going to be the country for kind of a pilot for transition funds, you really just haven't seen a lot of impact of those funds. You also haven't seen the complete meeting in terms of the what was pledged and what has been delivered. So I really do think, I mean, I sit here in the United States, and I think one of the things that's very interesting about the United States is that, you know, we are the largest oil and gas producer, and at the same time, we produce a lot of renewable energy. You know, in 2022, we sort of one of the largest climate legislative moves, the Inflation Reduction Act. And you're seeing like a very much of, in the United States, a kind of an all of the above, right? That we're very naturally resource rich, as is Brazil. We recognize the criticality of moving forward in the transition and moving renewable energy forward. And we want to produce oil and natural gas in a lower carbon way. So when you look at carbon emissions from energy production in the United States, we've seen reductions. So I do think it's important to understand the issue of demand, because I agree with what everyone has said, is that if you take that supply out, before you shift the demand picture, one, you're going to, low-income countries are going to bear the brunt. People on like lower incomes, when they have to go, when they're paying their, filling up their cars with gasoline. I mean, we're a little under 2 months from the U.S. election. If the price of gasoline in the United States right now were $4 plus a gallon, that would not sit well for the current, the incumbent. It wouldn't sit well for the Democratic Party because it's so price sensitive. So I say all of that to kind of highlight the complexities. And at the same time, I think that this is an energy evolution. We're still very much adding all new types of energy. I think this is an extraordinarily dynamic time for technology, innovation, ingenuity. Scala earlier that was here on the screen. When you look at data centers, think about the geopolitics of data centers. Where will data centers be located? They're going to be located in countries that can provide reliable power, ideally clean, renewable power. That's going to be part of, geopolitical power. So I think, again, going back to the earlier comments about, Brazil being an energy power and being a climate power, being a innovation power, I think those are all things that are really part of what is our energy transition.
Thank you. Obrigada, Caroline. Eu vou passar para o Tom. Você.
Now, you mentioned many hooks that I'd like to follow up on. Tom, please. The PCC reports mention risk, the risk of investing in new oil fronts. They call this rotten assets. How do you see the economic risk of investing in new gas and oil fronts at a moment when the world is trying to lower the carbon footprint, when countries have a mission to cut their emissions?
I'm glad you asked me this question because I was thinking, I forgot to mention this when I was giving my previous answer. Because we're talking about this whole idea of, transition has to be demand-led, and the responsibility of oil companies is, to Mauricio's point, maybe to be better oil companies. I think that the thing that I really forgot to say, and it really points to this, is even in a world where we don't have consensus around climate change, which I hope is not the world we live in, but even in what I would consider the worst case scenario for the climate, according to our economic predictions, oil demand globally is still going to peak in the next few years. And that's primarily driven by the electric vehicle revolution, which, whatever you read in the headlines, that is taking off in a very serious way, driven primarily by China. So if you don't believe what I'm saying, then I would say you're betting against China. So what that really means if you're an oil company, and this is, maybe why I would say you should be thinking carefully about investments into expanding oil production, is not necessarily because people are telling you not to do it because it's bad for the environment, because as we all just discussed, it's a lot more complex than that. I would just say, is it really a good idea economically if that's a long-term asset? And in particular, I mentioned OPEC before. OPEC has only ever existed in a world where global oil demand grows year on year. And so there's, and I mean, you're an expert on geopolitics, so you probably can speak to this better. But from my understanding, it's kind of already tough for them to get all of their members to play ball. What happens to OPEC in a world where oil demand is falling? Does that mean that they lose their discipline completely and the global oil price collapses? And does that mean that really you've made bad long-term investments in these oil assets? So that would be my advice to oil companies is this is not even just a moral obligation. I would actually say this is questionable economics to continue investing purely in the core business. Whereas, and again to Mauricio's point, the net zero world will still have oil demand. It will be a fraction of what it is today, but not an insignificant fraction, because a lot of oil is used for non-combustion purposes and materials, some of which will be important in the net zero world. So how do you position yourself today to be that winning company tomorrow? So as already mentioned, global oil, it competes on price today. So everyone's trying to be the lowest cost producer. How can we get that differentiation, to your point, around having some of these externalities priced in so that the winning barrel is the cleanest barrel? And I would say as oil-producing nations, you're in a good position to start arguing for the rules to make that happen so that your country can be one of the last standing in the oil market, because there is still going to be a role for oil in that world.
Muito obrigada. David, vou para você.
David, I'd like to go to you. 2 questions to you. I don't know how much time we have left. However, 5 minutes. I'm going to ask quick questions, and please answer quickly. I wanted to ask you about the U.S. election. The whole world is interested in this election. How can this change this scenario that we've discussed?
Just a word on the prior debate, if I could just for a second. I mean, every producer in the world thinks they're going to be the last producer standing in 2050. And so in the most optimistic scenario, we'll be using, right now we use 78% of the energy demand is from fossil fuels. Maybe it'll be 60%. And the future is going to be low cost, low carbon, and low risk. And so, the reality is there will be stranded assets. And this is an industry which lives with stranded assets. Most projects are de-risked in their first 7 years. U.S. shale, price goes below $40, they'll just shut in. And so, shut-ins are not new. So that's what's going to happen. And the market is changing also. The EU methane strategy is going to start scoring hydrocarbons that are imported in 2030 on their carbon footprint. You're not low carbon, you're not going to Europe. The U.S. will have to respond to the carbon border adjustment mechanism somehow. I'm not quite sure how we get there. We'll get to that in when I answer your first question. But the reality is the market's going to change, and it's going to cause huge frictions with the developing world, about whether they're going to spend the money to decarbonize to access the U.S. and other markets. So we'll come to that. And so that's where our elections come to play. If the race is 50-50 right now, the future of our Congress is undecided, also pretty much 50-50. We're probably looking at divided government in the Congress no matter what. If Kamala Harris wins the election, you'll see largely a continuation of the Biden policy, implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act, promulgation of the regulations, and then a lot of these, really billions of dollars in projects that are announced might reach final investment decision. There's bipartisan support for the IRA because a lot of the investment is in red states. If Donald Trump wins, he'll probably pull out of the Paris Agreement, and his ability, they won't roll back the IRA because it benefits a lot of Republican states, but the regulations to implement it are really important, and they can create a lot of havoc in basically changing those regulations, not issuing those regulations, and doing things like not issuing environmental permits for offshore wind. So tremendous uncertainty in the future of renewable energy in the United States if Donald Trump wins. And if there's a sweep on either side, you could see a bigger pendulum swing. A Republican sweep, hopefully you wouldn't, but you could see really, really a cap on tax subsidies, going forward. And a Democratic sweep, you could see, I think, adjustments in the IRA. But the reality is, and this really goes for the United States and the rest of the world, is there is no more big money coming in the United States. We've got big tax issues next year. So the future of climate policy is going to be in how do you get the market signals right? I took development economics in graduate school. It all comes down to 3 words: getting prices right. So where is the price signal going to come from? Carbon market? From standards like in steel and aluminum? From the insurance companies, demanding, certain standards? With that price signal, then all these investments from Exxon and Chevron and Petrobras, 15 billion, 20 billion there on low carbon solutions, hydrogen, carbon capture, might come to fruition, and renewable energy might scale up. Without that price signal, this transition, as Carolyn put it, is going to take a whole lot longer. And of course, now we're really not on track.
Thank you. Obrigada. Nós temos mais 5 minutos.
We have another 5 minutes. I implore them to give us 5 more minutes. Thomas King. I would ask you 2 things. Number 1, the renewable plan for Petrobras, Thomas King, where is it headed? Offshore, onshore? Is it being implemented? And could you please define what phenomenons are you seeing biofuels? What is their vision? We look at our Brazilian potential at Petrobras. As far as the electric is concerned, where there's stable markets and competitive prices, it's onshore wind. Why? Because we have very good winds and geography. To give you an idea, the same turbines placed in Brazil and in Europe, Brazil will get twice the energy that you'd get in Europe. So it can produce really inexpensive energy. Petrobras has traditionally worked with molecules, fossil molecules, the idea of transitioning to renewable molecules. We're already operating co-processing plants where vegetable oil goes in, oil goes in, and we get a diesel with 5% renewables. The challenge is to increase that investment, and that goes back to what was saying about the stranded costs before. When we build and when we roll out these new investments, we have to think that we have to take advantage of these assets beyond the oil. So the refined assets, we have to think how they can work with other resources other than oil. In that sense, we are building plants to produce jet fuel using 100% vegetable oil, important plants that we've discovered that can help supply the world. Lastly, and I would be remiss in not mentioning the carbon capture, which is fundamental as far as our goal to be a company that produces oil with the lowest footprint possible. In other words, capturing the CO2 that we emit. And the second movement that we're undertaking is to build these capturing, not in our oil fields, but we're looking at other geological constructions near the coast. We've discovered that throughout the Brazilian coastline, there are saline formations where we can capture the equivalent of 250 million tons of CO2 per year. That means capturing every year the equivalent of the emission of 5 Petrobrases. We can that over many years. So that would not only capture that from our plants, but we can also the steel-making plants and other industries. We can also capture their CO2. Thank you so much. The little time we have left, I have 2 questions. Number 1, the mechanisms that we have nowadays for transition, the carbon mechanisms, the price mechanism, the pricing, how do you see that dynamic between those different strategies? In other words, how can we internalize these externalities of the burning of oil? The other question has to do with within the university world, the academic world. You mentioned technologies. CCS is one of them. There are others. What technologies do you see out there?
So 2 things. I have to be quick. I agree with David. I think, the standards, a price, I think price really does matter. The idea of having a carbon tax in the United States is kind of like, oh my goodness, carbon tax. But I think if you talk to a lot of people, they would say that we would actually like a price. It would send like a good signal. So I think that very much matters. I think you find where there is a carbon tax, there's a clear price that sort of changes the landscape, and you sort of consider it in production. I think getting it on the global scale is very difficult. I think it's very challenging. So you see it's much more regional right now. But I do think that's really important. For the universities, listen, I'm at NYU. I've seen transformation in terms of how we think about, right now NYU has a climate initiative. We have tech incubators. We're really much about thinking about carbon tech. Lots of young people want to work in this space. By the way, when I used to teach the geopolitics of oil and natural gas, and now it's called the geopolitics of energy, because young people want to work in the clean energy space. They want to be purpose-driven. They want to work in areas where they don't feel that they're contributing to problems, but where they're contributing to solutions. So I think it's an incredibly dynamic environment for innovation. This past summer, I worked with a company that came out of one of the NYU incubators. It's called Air Company. They take carbon and they convert it. They originally started to convert it into alcohol. Now they convert it into sustainable aviation fuel. It's called Air Company. They're located in Brooklyn. And those types of, 9 Dot Energy, for example, that's another company that came out of an NYU incubator. So, across, if you go to MIT, you go to Stanford, you go to, Cornell Tech on Roosevelt Island. It's just brewing. It's like the percolation of all these ideas and innovations that are taking place in the clean tech space. So, I mean, I think there are things that we can't yet imagine, but that are in the works. And then there is the idea of the scalability. And I think, Thomas at Bloomberg New Energy Finance, incredible in terms of the way that they sort of publish the impacts of the technologies that are coming forward.
Muito obrigada. Nós vamos ter que encerrar.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have to end this panel. We could talk for a long time. Thank you so much for your time. It was great. Thank you.
Obrigada, Daniela, os nossos convidados.
Thank you, Daniela. Thank you to our guests. This was a great event to kick off our several events.
Develop products compatible with the forest comes from Brazilians. A strong agriculture that feeds the world is Brazilian. And the hard work, state-of-the-art research, and technological development come from Brazilians. Being recognized for productive capacity, a clean energy system, innovation, and the world's largest social inclusion program is also Brazilian. Just as being respected for talent that wins over the world comes from Brazilians. Apex Brazil takes our country to the whole world, promoting Brazilian products and Brazilians' talent. Exports are breaking records, producing the best results in history. And our country is going ever further to win the position it deserves in the world. It's Brazilian, it's sustainable, it's for the whole world. Apex Brazil, federal government, union and reconstruction.
Antes de iniciar os próximos painéis de debate.
Before going on to the next panels, the next session will be with Jorge Viana, the president of Apex Brazil, which is a company that promotes Brazilian businesses and investments. It's a conversation about Brazil's potential to attract foreign investment through its leadership in energy transition. This also will be the launching of the bilateral trade map Brazil-US that's produced by Apex and the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce. So I will pass the floor to Abrão Neto from the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce. Abrão Neto and Jorge Viana, welcome. Good morning, everybody. I think they really warmed up this event very nicely for us. I also want to greet Ambassador Correia do Lago and Ambassador Lowney. Thank you so much. I also want to thank everyone here in the audience, and also Jorge Viana, who's with me here, the president of Apex Brazil, who promote Brazilian trade and investments. You've been a really important player in highlighting the importance of Brazil. We heard about the bilateral trade map that you are launching. It's a bilateral trade map of the investments between Brazil and U.S. I think this highlights a very well-known fact that Brazil is the greatest investor in Brazil in terms of its stock, capital stock. There's been a huge wave of investments over the last 150 years, but your report shows indicators that shows a new wave of investments that are beginning with a very specific profile in technology, data centers, critical minerals and clean energy. Can you talk a little bit about this phenomenon and how Brazilian investments are changing in Brazil? Thank you, Abraão. Thank you, the Brazilian American Chamber, Amcham Brasil, and all the organizers, Ambassador André, who is our Consul General here in New York, our colleagues at Apex. This is an event that really brings together people who could make great contributions. I see a lot of people here, Tomazoni, people from the private sector, from the public sector. This is very important in such a challenging moment in our planet's history. This is not a minor issue. We are undergoing an extraordinary moment of opportunities and threats at the same time. And the threats let us explore these opportunities. In Brazil, recently Brazil was part of the problem. The deforestation had doubled. They were absent from the debates on transitions and absent in as far as the transition. Brazil refused to host a COP in the last administration, and Brazil has a historical role, but now that's over. Brazil has a new administration under President Lula's government. It's his third administration, and now Brazil has a leader with experience, a well-known leader who's respected abroad, and who's showing a new face of Brazil. This new dynamic has a lot to do with the U.S. The U.S. is the best client of Brazilian products. Mainly, some would say, isn't it China? From a numerical standpoint, it is the greatest trade partner now. $104 billion they purchase from Brazil, and they export $50 billion to Brazil. The U.S., approximately 50. However, the imports that the U.S., what Brazil imports are products with value added. So two things about China. I said this to the ambassador and to the Chinese authorities. I told them, look, you have trade 3 times bigger with the U.S., and the U.S. has 3 times as much investment than China in Brazil. So that's the point. The U.S. investments in Brazil, almost $250 billion when you add them up. Only greenfield projects last year were $7 billion announced, $7 billion announced. And so such an important trade partner, we have to treat them with tremendous importance. That's our mission. President Lula wants this. He wants closer ties. Are there some political problems to be resolved? Yes, let's resolve them. But business has to go forward, especially at such an important moment in the world history. So we at IPEX are working in a very pragmatic fashion toward this. And I think the U.S. needs to be seen very clearly. That's why we have launched this document. It's available to all of you, not only in print, but I also want to pass to all of you a link where you can see this, and we're going to try to take advantage of the opportunities that exist between Brazil and U.S. We don't have a lot of time, but the Forum for Attracting Investment is a partnership with the Interdevelopment Bank. Will be on the 25th of October after the first round of the elections. It will be in São Paulo. And I want to make a challenge. Next year, let the Brazil Investment Forum be here in New York. Brazil is ready to come to the U.S. We have lots of funds, and we have an agenda just like the one here, which is very important. It goes everywhere from energy transition to the challenges in food security, and necessarily has a social dynamic. You can't have a energy transition without leaving the world so unequal as it is. That's the challenge, and I'll leave it at that, and I will then await the
Thank you very much, President. Challenge accepted by Amcham. You can count on us to organize that. But that beef, of course, will have the opening by the President of Brazil. The idea is to have the President, Minister Haddad, the big talk about big companies that Brazil, in fact, for the United States and the world, is an extraordinary space to attract investments. That is very important. You said, you talked about 7 million in investments in greenfield in United States and Brazil. That shows that if you take a transversal cut of the last 10 years, 2023 was a record number of projects, 126 projects announced by the United States and Brazil. I would like now to use the opportunity. You talked about attraction factors that Brazil may have for foreign investments, especially in the sector we're discussing, energy and cleaner transition and cleaner energies. What is potential to Brazil? What's Brazil's green card for that? Well, I look at the site to the international CEO of the JBS, which is a big group here in the United States and the world, and Brazil too. The attractions go from A to Z. For instance, if you talk about agribusiness, Brazilian agribusiness today have an external dependence of almost 80% of its participants. In other words, we have a very big dependency in fertilizer purchase in Brazil. So today there's a huge space for groups that want to invest and decrease Brazil's dependence in the fertilizer. We are working to have cheaper gas, half of the price of today. Petrobras is working in that regard because that is key for us. I would like to, there's many interesting attraction factors. Again, I'm going to make a connection with the United States, Brazil. China today is investing, I was saying that yesterday, $675 billion in clean energy today. Talking about $675 billion. United States, $300 billion. Brazil is number 6 in that ranking with $34 billion, except that that amount of $675 billion is 3% of the China GDP in the United States. That's about 1% of the GDP of the United States. Even if we're talking $300 billion. And in Brazil, that represents 2% of our GDP, the 34 billions that we are investing. That is an area that is very important. But I'd like to say that for the transition, we're going to have to decarbonize to work new industries. For instance, we have a little bit of the absence of the United States. We have, for instance, in the electric cars and batteries, we have China, and a little bit of the United States with that. But when we go into renewables, green hydrogen, we have France, Australia, Spain, Italy, Germany, and we don't have the United States, which is a great area to attract investment. Then we have critical ores too. Brazil's always have the number 1, 2, or 3 critical ores, and the United States are absent from that investment. That's why I'm bringing here as new opportunities. Besides the technology area that Brazil's United States are already doing, requires great spaces that Amazon is building there. That requires a lot of energy. We have to think about big energy, and Brazil has an energy matrix of almost 80% of clean renewables. That is probably the greatest attraction factor for investments there. So, to conclude this discussion, what is the Brazilian government doing, especially Apex, to make easier the investment for all these opportunities with Brazil presence today? Yeah, the day before yesterday, we had a great event at the Planalto Palace. President Lula has made a point of presenting Brazil as a country with a consolidated democracy, with an inviolable economic status today in the world that also has a lot of opportunities. Apex, that works in attracting investments, is committed to that. We've never had such a great environment as we have now. Brazil will host the COP30. We're leadership in the BRICS. We're going back to a protagonist role that we had renounced and doing great things. For instance, with Lula, we have conducted 11 events in different countries. We're going to have one in Mexico now, all of them with the presence of the Brazilian president and local president. That is an extraordinary space. That is why I'm proposing next year would host it here in New York, in the United States next year, because we're talking about the biggest economy on the planet, which is a lot of people here want to invest the correct way today, and Apex is the agency that works with that. We have a direct connection with the government, with the Planalto Palace. The president invited me to preside Apex because of our experience and the relationship we have over 40 years. So Petrobras is a critical role based on the development of the country. BNDES resumed its role as the most important bank to attract investments in Brazil. So we have a viable economical environment with the tax reforms. Everything is ongoing, and IPEX is working as a regulation of sectors. You can see carbon market policy, offshore policy for wind also has been presented. The new forest code was presented by me, giving legal security for Brazilian lands. So Brazil now created a very interesting space, and that's why I say that we already accumulated $1 trillion in investments, direct foreign investments I'm talking about, and we are also changing the foreign trade. In 2 to 2.5 years, we're going to be in $1 trillion in investment flow. Brazilian reserves had been reduced in $60 billion. Now they resume growth in another $40 billion this year, and we'll go from $400 billion going up to show foreign investors what we need to show. And I'm going to close. This is not a critique, just a comment. I was talking the other day with one of the owners of the JBS group. They had come to New York, hadn't been here in 7 years, and he was impressed with the lack of information of important sectors of the financial world in New York that things are changing and they were still outdated in their understanding. So we have a narrative there that became kind of a little bit of vitiated in talking about bad things about Brazil, when Brazil is showing robust data showing that Brazil changed for the better. It has a security environment today, and people are saying now that things are changing, and that's what's happened in Brazil. I came here for that. I'm not here to give you fake data, but just to show you the information. We're going to host COP30. I hope our ambassador will be an important authority at that event, and I really hope that will show that we are changing and building a new world with the new consumption patterns that have renewable matrices, and it will be a world of peace and social inclusion. Thank you very much. I hope we can access the investment maps showing several new opportunities, so we'll be together here. Thank you very much. Thank you, both of you, for your presentation. We already have bid in the event for next year.
Rio de Janeiro is the only state in Brazil that increased its native vegetation, cover, and reduced deforestation by 68% across its territory. We are close to reaching zero deforestation. We have carried out the biggest sanitation concession in the history of Brazil, which will benefit more than 13 million people. We are cleaning up Guanabara Bay. Beaches unsuitable for bathing are bathable, like Flamengo Beach. The return of marine fauna to Guanabara Bay is now a reality. In the process of energy transition, Rio de Janeiro is one of the first states to require a mitigation plan and gas emission inventory for new developments. We are the largest national producer of biomethane, a biofuel produced from urban waste. Considered the energy of the future, change towards a sustainable and resilient planet depends on all of us.
I would like to remind you all that the event is being transmitted live on YouTube, LinkedIn, and the coverage will also be available in our network, in our site, and our printed newspaper tomorrow if you want to see it again, share, or live the discussions again. We also have English coverage in Valor International. If you want to share it with the foreign language partners or just to monitor it, all the digital coverage will be in the Valor International website. Let's go to the next panel. Brazil and the United States leading together energy transition. In order to moderate, I will call again Daniela Chiaretti, special environmental reporter for Valor Econômico. Dani, you have the floor again. Now we have another panel talking about cooperation Brazil-United States with other geopolitical aspects. I would like to remind you that a few days ago, Carlos Nobre, the Brazilian scientist that is world reference for the risk of collapse of the Amazon if it keeps deteriorated and deforested. Luckily, this is being reversed by the new government. It gave us an interview that's saying that he was scared with the speed of the global climate change. He wrote the whole world in its climate science did not forecast such an intense and fast climate change as we've seen recently. In early 2023, scientists forecasted a greatly nobody expected the global temperature would explode and become 5 centigrade degrees hotter. He says it's in July of 2024. We're saying that since June of 2023, we've been living temperatures over 1.5 higher centigrade. That the last August, melt of August, was the highest ever registered, and the Earth only saw something like that in the last interglacial period 20,000 years ago or 60,000 years ago. So with this context, I would like to call our panelists. Brazil, United States, leading together energy transition. The first person I have the pleasure of calling.
My boss, the Assistant Secretary for Energy Resources, was in Brasilia and Minas Gerais meeting with public and private sector partners and talking about how we can cooperate more concretely on clean energy and on critical minerals as well. And Minas, of course, was a great place to talk about critical minerals. And then 2 weeks ago, we relaunched our critical mineral, or now strategic minerals is what we're calling it, dialogue with Brazil. And that is, again, an important initiative to try to bring together our financing agencies from the U.S. government as well as our policy arms of the U.S. government together with our Brazilian counterparts to say how do we concretely get projects off the ground in Brazil. And if I might mention as well, there's a multilateral effort that the U.S. helped launch 2 years ago called the Mineral Security Partnership. So that's a huge priority for us. We don't have an energy transition if we don't have the inputs, so the strategic minerals. And Brazil has obviously huge resources in this area. And is not just for extraction, clearly. Brazil is a very advanced economy with the infrastructure and the human capital and all of the elements to move completely along the value chain from production, processing, manufacturing. So I would highlight that as another very key area in which we want to work with Brazil to develop supply chains for critical minerals bilaterally, and we invite Brazil to participate in the Mineral Security Partnership, which is 15 economies globally that are bringing our public and private financing agencies and arms together to get projects off the ground. And then also, to think of ways in which we can work in third countries together and on supply chains for things like inputs for solar and wind, electrolyzers for hydrogen. All of this is ripe for cooperation.
Thank you. Muito obrigada.
Thank you. I'm here looking. I don't know if I'm going to the Secretary Aline or the Ambassador. I think I'm going to talk first with the Ambassador, with the Secretary Aline. Ambassador, give me a second. I will ask you, what is the Brazilian government's and MIDIC's vision about critical minerals? Strategic minerals. Yeah, critical and strategic. Thank you, Daniela. Well, I think we also already have a consensus that critical minerals are almost like a prerequisite for energy transition. So I think it's important here that we be very clear and share here that I think that we are very aligned with the American or U.S. government in that respect. And Brazil has this potential because it's one of the great producers of critical and strategic minerals in the world, except that we have very clear in our government that we don't want to be just a producer and exporter of these minerals to the world. We want to invest and add value and improve our production capabilities based on critical minerals. And with that, I think that not only we want to do that, but we have all the potential, all the conditions today to proceed in that manner. I think that today was mentioned here, especially by Jorge Biana. Previously, we have our energy matrix is absolutely super clean. We have a electrical energy transmission network that's extremely connected and modern. We are one of the best universities in the global south training our resources and research institutes that do research that could subsidize this development. And since early this year, we have a national plan for the next 10 years for industrialization of Brazil. NIB, New Industry Brazil, has goals and objectives that are very clear for Brazil, involving several areas and actions that are connected for Brazil's industrial development. We are thinking decarbonization, sustainability, and we also have health, industrial complex, and digital transformation. We are very clearly focused in Mission 4 of the development of production chains of robotics, semiconductors, and other digital articles. So we have a very clear vision that Brazil has a very strategic role in critical material issues, but we do have we want to add value to our development. Ambassador, I have several questions for you, but the first one then, let's start. Brazil today is the president of the G20. Among the several Brazilian initiatives in the G20, one of them is the climate task force that is yours. So I would like to know from you what we can expect from that, Ambassador. since this is an event with the United States, I am going to highlight a little bit the opportunities that we have, and then complementing what my dear George said about the importance of the United States in the relationship, and the importance of the United States also in the work that we've been developing in the G20 and other negotiations as well. G20 has been a very interesting experience because we try to bring the climate issue as well as energy transition. So we're aiming to widen the discussion in order to highlight the circumstances of countries such as Brazil, which is countries that are in development. They're not COP countries, they are G20 countries in development that need investment. Countries that have huge potential to contribute to the world economy that need to be, this potential has to be developed. So I want to go back to what you said right in the beginning, Daniela, which is the issue of urgency. We are in a situation where we cannot give ourselves the luxury of start to think about what we're going to do 10 years from now. We have to start doing things now, of course, thinking and mid and long range too, but we have to do everything possible, the fastest possible, vis-a-vis the urgency that I think it's has never been as clear. And you know that Brazil has been an extraordinarily difficult year with all the phenomena that we've been seeing that has been very devastating, droughts and floods and fires. If you look at that with all the government is trying to do, is a very coherent policy that we've seen the G20, that we will see in the COP29 and COP30 next year. And that is the issue that I insist upon, that I believe more and more that this moment in the world where we see that sustainable development, fighting climate change, and it's very intense, is the moment of Brazil. So Brazil has a key role in this context because we have the circumstances to use this moment. So I think what's being developed here, and it's being talked about here, we are rethinking the Brazilian industrial policy. We are rethinking Brazilian development with the new elements that are climate and fighting poverty. So the international agenda, I believe, could favor Brazil in a big way. What we cannot do is waste this opportunity. We need to be aware that the more the world is demanding, the more sustainable Brazil could be, and Brazil could respond a lot faster than other countries. And the understanding of the United States within vis-a-vis this context is essential. That's why we are developing several bilateral ideas, including fair work, which is an extraordinary opportunity of understanding between Presidents Biden and Lula, as well as the area of energy area, the critical strategic mineral area, and of course climate change in general. This is an extremely important. I think George Viana raised this issue of how much the United States are still a central partner for Brazil, and how much this moment of sustainable development and climate change is a moment to modernize and take a new look at the kind of investment the United States take in Brazil, and it's very important. Thank you, Ambassador. I think now we raised the ball for you about Morgan, about bid. On the one side, we see the United States with this important movement to decarbonize their economy, very strong with this administration, and Brazil with important environment agendas. How can bid in the as a multilateral organism could help, and I think to help align these interests. Well, thank you for the question. It's a pleasure to be here, sharing this panel with my colleagues, Ambassador Andre, Laura, Aline. It's a pleasure to be here representing BID. As a matter of fact, I'd like to share what was said here about the urgency and absolute existential momentum that the world's going through. So I'd like to focus a little bit as a representative of a multilateral bank where Brazil and the United States are the main shareholders, 1 and 2. As a matter of fact, what the opportunities we see in this relationship as a whole, and what has been the BID's discourse is that Latin America, and especially Brazil, is a source of solutions for global challenges. We understand that opportunities that have been already remarked upon here before by the other colleagues offers opportunities for the world to advance in the decarbonization agenda. Brazil, due to the fact that it has a huge resources in solar, wind, as well as all the biofuel industries at the level that it's being offered, offers an opportunity for the United States. Don't forget that the United States, according to Bloomberg, has already $30 billion in assets in the administration, but will grow at a rate of 90% a year compounded, going to $40 trillion. That resource for investments here in the United States has to be geared towards those projects, more profitable projects that Brazil offers. Brazil has already a very mature industry regarding the issue of clean energy, but has everything that has to do with green fuels, talking about fuels of the future. Also today I'm talking about the legal framework. Today the Senate approved a new program that we are supporting that will allow that investors, foreign investors, including the United States, that resource pool interested in promoting decarbonization could also mitigate the exchange risk, which is a very important landmark. So I think that when you look at the world, Brazil offers a series of opportunities to be the source of solutions. We also, just to think of one specific industry, reforesting, which is very important in Brazil.
So we heard before about the price of carbon. It's very important to have a fair price, so some of these reforestation projects can move forward. Some are giving high prices. So if you think about the amount, it could be 7 to 10 tons by area reforested. So we're talking about a potential industry that could generate 500 per hectare per year. That's twice of what cattle produces. So for the 10 largest companies now, they have tremendous commitments in the voluntary market. There's a natural opportunity for U.S. investors who are interested in decarbonizing to look at Brazil, not mentioning the clean energy grid, which was already mentioned. 90% of Brazil's electrical energy comes from renewable resources. And that brings to mind the power shoring. In other words, bringing outside companies to take advantage of Brazil's opportunities. We at the BID think this is a unique opportunity. We see great interest from U.S. investors and investors from other countries, but we understand that there are numerous opportunities. We are ready and we're interested in financing these, be it corporate investments or investments with the support of other governments, but we are ready to support. Thank you. Now I want to go back to Laura and ask you, can you tell us a little more about these negotiations that Brazil and the U.S. are undertaking with respect to energy. Can you tell us a little bit about what is the U.S.'s interest? You spoke a little bit about, but if you could talk a little bit more about it.
Thank you. Just to reemphasize that the U.S. sees Brazil as a significant partner across the full range of the issues that we have been discussing. So everything from decarbonization efforts to clean energy deployment and the development of clean energy technologies. So I think a very good way to illustrate some of the commitment that we have on that front is to look at some of the collaboration that we've been having for a number of years, which has only deepened. And critical minerals, we've been working with Brazil in the mining sector on the governance and management side for a number of years, and we've stepped that up recently. We just signed a new work plan with the Ministry of Mines and Energy and Brazil's Geological Survey in May of this year, and it's very specific cooperation, for example, on fiscal regimes for certain minerals projects and midstream market development studies, again, concrete ways we can move this forward. Methane, we heard from Petrobras earlier, but we're lending regulatory assistance to the oil and gas regulator, ANP, and working with the Ministry of Mines and Energy as well on things like gas emissions certifications. Then solar supply chain diversification. We've held a number of roundtables with public and private sectors to talk about component manufacturing, how we move that forward. Carbon capture and storage was also mentioned earlier, and we're working together to develop the legal and regulatory regimes around that. Also, grid improvements, the need to modernize the grids in order to accept the variable renewable sources to a greater degree. Things like battery storage. And we've talked recently to a Brazilian company, doing amazing things in the battery storage space. And then clean hydrogen is the last one just to highlight. And we are, again, working together on policy and regulations as the world wraps its head around how to advance on clean hydrogen and use it as a way to decarbonize our industrial sectors. So that's just, again, a glimpse into some of the very specific ways in which we're working together to move ahead.
Thank you. Embaixador, o senhor falou de novo.
Mr. Ambassador, you talk about urgency. Yesterday you said at Colombia, yesterday the key word was urgency. What is the role of the COPs? The COP at Dubai established a goal of tripling renewables by 2030 and intensifying efficiency, and that the countries needed to step back from fossil fuels in the future. How do we move forward in this space? That is the great question this year. How do we interpret transition away from fossil fuels, which is, it's hard to translate that into Portuguese. It's translated in many different ways, but the idea is just what you said, to move away from gradually from fossil fuels. That is the great theme of the day. Why? Because first, it enters into the it works with the developing countries, the developed countries. How can we differentiate this transition? Which countries can continue to produce oil for longer periods of time? How can we classify the different types of oils, those that emit more, those that emit less, what extraction processes emit more, which one emit less? So all of these questions are being discussed right now, but indeed this is a theme. I don't want to make the interpreter's job hard, but these are very tricky questions. There are many questions raised at the COP, and the COPs are really they're really phases. Sometimes they deal with predictable things, sometimes unpredictable. Now we're talking about an essential subject for COP29, which is financing. Financing within the context of the convention. Brazil's working hard at the G20 with respect to financing outside of the convention. What does that mean? Inside the convention, there's a separation between countries, developing and developed countries, and we highlight the needs of the poor countries. As we said earlier, what we have to assure, and the Development Bank has been an extraordinary partner in this, that there has to be investment in Brazil. Brazil doesn't need aid, it needs investment. It has extraordinary capacities, which has already been mentioned. In the academic world, we have scientists, we have institutions, we have everything ready to deliver, to do what's needed. And as far as energy is concerned, we have this immense range, not only of existing projects, but also potential. So on the existing front, I wanted to mention a very important element in our relationship with the U.S. It's the biofuels. Biofuels, it's interesting because Brazil and the U.S. believed in biofuels for mixing into fuel for autos. The U.S. became the largest producer, Brazil the second largest, and that really brought us a lot closer in the energy front. But what happened? What's the great new step forward? It's the question of jet fuel. Jet fuel really gave a whole new dimension to the concept of biofuels, and the same with respect to navigation fuel. So Brazil and the U.S. undoubtedly are the two countries that can most contribute in this space. If we don't collaborate, it makes no sense. We have to work together. We're not competitors. The world will need a lot of biofuels, jet and navigation fuels, and we have to collaborate, specifically also in creating standards, etc. This is also a very important area for us to collaborate. And as far as the future is concerned, green hydrogen, and many different color hydrogens, Brazil can contribute. The important thing is the new fuels that reduce emissions. I think the important is reducing emissions. And I apologize for insisting on the question of urgency, but it's very important to use technologies that exist and work hard on those that are coming down the line. But if we gather all those that exist, the U.S. and Brazil have a lot to do together. And if we mention what we can develop, we also have even more areas to collaborate. So that's an area that will really seal a new dimension of partnership between the U.S. and Brazil. Thank you very much. Morgan? In the area of investments in adaptation and resilience, Brazil needs this so much. And can you talk a little bit about the social sphere, that the impact that those investments can have in that space? Yes, you're absolutely right. That's fundamental. It doesn't compete in urgency with mitigation, but it is absolutely central. As a matter of fact, we've seen important movement in the space of adaptation in Brazil. After the floods in Recife, we have advanced very quickly. We approved $260 million to help those communities that lived in hilly areas that were vulnerable to flooding, with draining projects, micro-draining projects, alert systems, early alert systems. This is just one example of the type of projects on the urban level that we are involved in. But at the ministry, the urban ministry, there are great efforts to recognize and adopt the best practices in this space. But we understand that there is also a whole question about the wildfires. We're really trying to know how to manage the forests in a more efficient way, and also how to manage water systems and sanitation, all that. But your question also has to do with the social side. I think the fair transition, which is of concern to all of us, is central. We had a recent study focused on Brazil that showed that 7 million green jobs can be generated associated with this transition. When we spoke to Ambassador André, he mentioned Safi and the tremendous opportunities. The way we see it, these are huge opportunities. But of course, these investments also have to be accompanied with adaptations. As this was already mentioned, unfortunately, Brazil is undergoing some really difficult situations with respect to wildfires, and also in Rio Grande do Sul, we saw the flooding there. We were also involved in the recovery there of the flooding in the south of Brazil. The future is here, unfortunately. It's here to stay. We have to invest. The government is ready, and we have a host of policies. We're very positive about this, but we have to do it. We have to act. Secretary Aline. Next week, there's an interesting event. I know that this is an initiative that you really encourage with 3 different ministers. It's about the energy transition from a gender standpoint. Could you talk quickly about that? Of course. Well, I'll be really fast. I could spend all morning talking about this. I think since last year, the Lula administration has been really concerned about social justice in this sphere. We're very clear that the energy transition must be fair. So along the many fronts that we're working in this aspect to assure that these projects take social justice into account, we are focusing on the question of gender. We worked with the UN since last year. During the COP, we signed a letter of commitment to structure the financing for a just and green transition with the optics of social justice. And within this, we began a movement where women in the financing space, to help them make this transition. We're very clear about how these women who operate either in the public space, who help designing public policy, to women who manage or vice presidents or CEOs of private banks, public banks, they're very clear that we need to have projects. We need to use this opportunity to guarantee and advance questions of gender equality. So this movement began with the Ministry of Agriculture. Banco do Brasil is one of our great allies in this space. And we will have our event at 8 a.m. on Monday here near here to talk about how women in finance can help direct these investments and these resources to have a fair transition. Thank you. Unfortunately, we've already, our time is over, but I still want to ask Laura and the ambassador one more question. I don't want to miss this opportunity. I wanted to ask you a little bit about energy security. In a world with so many conflicts and so much climate crises, what is the U.S. doing to create a more resilient system?
Thank you very much. Yes, so we look at, energy security is national security, is economic security, is social security. It's all intertwined, obviously. And, our ultimate goal is we believe that the, true energy security will come from more locally sourced, more renewable, sustainable forms of energy. Obviously, it's going to take us a little while to get there. Brazil and the United States are large oil and gas producers, and that is helping on the energy security side globally. And in fact, Brazil, US, and a couple of others like Guyana are the ones who are sustaining the production of oil as OPEC Plus has made some cuts. So that's an important part of our immediate energy security landscape. But again, as we've all recognized, we cannot stay with the status quo at all. So while decarbonizing those supply chains to the extent possible, we need to move forward at full force, full speed, as the ambassador said, in developing the more sustainable and reliable dispatched forms of energy. And that comes through what we've been talking about this morning. So that's why the U.S. is trying to play a huge role on that front with our landmark pieces of legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, where we are putting a lot of money into research and development, into supporting innovation, into trying to scale up these technologies to make them more broadly available globally, to bring down the prices so that they're more accessible. So that hopefully answers your question in just a few words.
Thank you very much. Eu levei muita bronca aqui.
I've been severely criticized because I've gone way over my time, but Ambassador, if you could just give us a few last words. You can say whatever you want, actually.
Pouco retomando o que você estava dizendo, essa questão da gente ter que equilibrar a segurança energética é absolutamente central, é uma preocupação de sempre, e nós temos visto que o mundo está numa crise geopolítica considerável, mas tanto o Brasil como os Estados Unidos.
It's a considerable one, but Brazil and the U.S. are countries that have many resources, many energy possibilities, but precisely because this is an event between Brazil and the U.S., I really want to insist on how technology plays an important role. Among the countries in development and those developed countries and the tropical countries, there are institutions, extraordinary institutions in our countries that can contribute immensely toward energy security. As a matter of fact, contribute to other developing countries. Our Brazilian experience can be adapted to other developing countries. There are so many varied conditions in the developing world, and we can work with the U.S. to bring these technologies to these developing countries to really contribute to these in the U.S.
Obrigada a vocês todos.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your contribution.
Obrigada, Daniela. Obrigada aos painelistas.
Thank you, Daniela. Thank you for the members of our panel. We will be back with you shortly.
É investir em projetos sustentáveis com benefícios sociais e ambientais. É incentivar a produção sustentável no campo. É ampliar o acesso a energias renováveis. É reduzir a emissão dos gases de efeito estufa. É reflorestamento e conservação florestal. É um compromisso do Banco do Brasil.
Dando prosseguimento à nossa agenda, vamos agora ao próximo painel.
Let's move forward to the next panel. Brazil, U.S., how to unblock our potential in renewable energy. Our moderator will be Francisco Góes, from Valor Econômico. He is at the Rio desk. Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. Such an important event with respect to Brazil-U.S. cooperation. And also, this is of great importance to the world as a whole, I'd say. Well, to continue with our conversation, our roundtables, I want to call the panel members up to the stage. Let's start with Abrão Neto, CEO from Amcham Brasil. Barry Glickman, President of Sustainable Technologies for Honeywell. Gilberto Tomazoni, Global CEO of JBS. Luisa Palacio, Senior Researcher for the University of Columbia, the Center of Global Energy Policy. And Paula Kowarski, the Vice President of M&A, Sustainability and Strategy.
Bem.
We just heard about the viewpoint of the governments, and at this panel, we're going to talk about how to open the potential, take advantage of the potential between Brazil and the U.S. in the renewable sector. We have JBS, Honeywell, and Rising present. On the private sector, we have the academic world present, all giving us our visions. So to begin our conversation, I wanted to ask each one of you to briefly introduce yourselves, but what we're talking about is bilateral cooperation. What could be done to increase partnership in this space? How do you see this potential of transitioning in this bilateral space? Thank you very much. Good morning. I think there's a lot of space, a lot of interest actually, to cooperate between Brazil and the U.S. Perhaps a good backdrop, as was mentioned here, is the fact that Brazil and the U.S. are global leaders in the space of climate, energy, and agribusiness, and also in the convergence of those three areas, which is where the biofuels. We are the two largest producers of biofuels. We have great technology and knowledge and know-how to help that market grow. Some data from the International Energy Agencies says we need to grow 11% per annum by 2030. And of course, the two countries best positioned for this are precisely Brazil and the U.S. But to go right to the heart of your question, I think there are at least 4 great cooperation avenues between Brazil and the U.S. Regulatory cooperation, financing cooperation, corporate financing, and global financing. I'll quickly talk about each one. The regulatory front, that means exchanging best practices and experiences in the development and implementation of the rules for the energy transition. Brazil has its own rules. The U.S. has its own rules. Now we need to talk. We need to have a convergence, and we need to have dialogue and build bridges. The example of SAFI, the U.S. has SAFI One Challenge. Brazil has just approved the law for the future of fuels. And so now we need to do a lot of hard work to try to see where we could create standards that are more consistent. This is true also for hydrogen. This is true for all the renewable energy. In some cases, Brazil doesn't even have a legislation, for example, the offshore wind energy, and it could perhaps look at the U.S. as an important partner. Then there's the financial aspect. 3/4 of the financing today for renewables come from the private sector, but the public sector has an important part to play, and in our estimation, the support and investment stimulation agencies, the BNDES, the U.S. Financing Corporation, they could work closer to facilitate the investments to expand the volume in this area. So corporate investments is really a way to grow joint ventures, research, and other areas, etc. And last, Tomazoni, I think, is very excited about the global space. Brazil and the U.S. shouldn't see themselves only as competitors. They need to ask, what can we do together to develop the international energy, renewable energy market? How can we reduce trade barriers to biofuels? And what the ambassador just said is, how can we help other countries adopt these technologies? I think there's a lot of hard work to be done. I think there's tremendous possibilities. Thank you, Abrão. So building on what you just said, I want to give the floor to Tomazoni. Tomazoni, you mentioned you lead the food security and renewables. You work with the G20. Brazil and the U.S. have an important role to play in this space. How have these discussions advanced at the G20? And also, how about the Brazilian proposal of the Alliance Against Hunger? Thank you for your question. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Maria Fernanda, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. This is such an important event, which really gives resonance to everything that was spoken about last week by all the ministers of agriculture of the G20 who met here, who met in Cuiabá, excuse me. And everything that we're talking has tremendous resonance with what they said, and it's precisely in the document that will be discussed by the G20.
The tasks of food system and agriculture took to the ministers there. It's not very different from what we are discussing. First thing is that food systems, when I say that, goes from grain production to the consumer. Everything is part of the system. They can have a big contribution with the challenges that is one of the biggest challenges the world has ever faced. It's the challenge of climate change and food security and energy security. So if we transform food systems, they could contribute expressively in capturing, in the case of climate, 9 to 23% of total emissions could be captured by these systems. And besides that, they could promote or end poverty, or at least if we are in Brazil putting this as one of the themes of G20, the issue of a world agreement against hunger, and on the other side, promote economic development. As it was said here, green investment promotes growth. We brought, to simplify, 3 pillars to do this transformation or undertake. First, we have to increase productivity. How do we do that? Through the adoption of biotechnology, digitalization of agriculture, and intensive use of renewable practices, utilizing a minimum of, or as little environmental impact as possible. So doing that, you can increase productivity. Second pillar is the pillar of the resources necessary for the system transition. We did a calculation by the large pact, Daniela is here too, that we will need $300 to $350 billion per annum until 2030 to undertake this transition. So we have to acknowledge that we need this money. Only 4% today of the investments that go to climate issues go to agriculture. And number two, we're going to have have innovative systems in order to finance that transition, because you have to put the small producer at the center of this. 30% of food today is produced by family agricultures or farmers. We have to have investments that are viable economically or feasible and are sustainable, environmentally responsible. So the proposals, one of them is that we create a systems can be discussed by the minister in G20 to pay for environmental services. That would be a manner to make it more efficient, because the farmer, if he's going with a small farmer, if he has a maturation time and that is not sufficient, there is an initial negative cash generation, and we need protection against risks that he has in that investment. And lastly, what was discussed here, this cooperation Brazil-United States, is to foment commerce based on science, and that we are able to use world trade to end hunger and incentivize more sustainable practices throughout the world. Thank you. I'd like to give the word to Barry now. Barry. Honeywell is a company that has a big portfolio in products and services. It's a technology company that goes from aerospace to energy, and I understand the energy segment has been growing within Honeywell's portfolio. So maybe we can go a little more in detail now, if you could give us your view or the possibilities of cooperation that there are in ethanol, for instance, between Brazil and the United States.
Thank you for the invitation and the question. So let me provide, at a high level, 3 specific areas for Brazil-U.S. cooperation. So the first is clearly around renewable fuels. So Brazil is a global leader in HFO today, is a global leader in low carbon intensity ethanol. That provides the framework for Brazil to continue to lead in HVO or renewable diesel, as well as to lead in SAF. Honeywell is one of the largest global technology providers of process technology for renewable diesel and SAF. We already have relationships with Petrobras and Osselin and Shell globally. So there's a great opportunity there to build upon what Brazil has already accomplished and make Brazil a global leader, not only an exporter of feedstock, but an exporter and a consumer of the finished fuels. The second area, I think, for opportunity between our countries is in carbon capture. And I thought the ambassador made an outstanding point repeatedly that sunk in around urgency. And as much as we like to talk about SAF as an important market for decarbonization, SAF represents 2% of global CO2 and 3% of global GHG. So it's important, but it's not the main battlefield. Carbon capture is a here and now opportunity. The technology exists. Petrobras, in particular, has a multi-decade history of successfully utilizing carbon capture for enhanced oil recovery. It's a short journey from EOR to sequestration. Brazil is blessed with onshore and offshore geographic reservoirs, and that is a tremendous opportunity. And then I think the third opportunity is around manufacturing. And right now, when we look at projects for both carbon capture and renewable fuels in Brazil, it's largely Brazil importing fabricated material from outside of Brazil. And it reminds me of really where Petrobras probably was 30 plus years ago. So there's an opportunity to localize that footprint, Brazil for Brazil, as well as Brazil as a manufacturing center for other parts of the world.
Obrigado, Barry. Teremos a oportunidade de...
Thanks, Barry. We will have the opportunity to go more into detail. Now I'd give you the word on this theme of the ethanol, so you can give us your vision and about ethanol production in Brazil, especially based in sugarcane, where Brazil is very competitive. What are the opportunities and challenges that you see? Good morning. Thanks for an invitation to participate with you. We talked about, each one of us in a certain way, talked about a combination of issues, because we're talking about energy transition, energy security, food security, and technology to make these things happen in a fair manner. Sugarcane maybe is one of the best examples of the link to make this chain work. Certainly is the energy prop that is most efficacious in transforming solar in sustainable biomass. We're in the journey to use the most energy contained in sugarcane to produce more and more food and energy, because this is to be a combined equation. We cannot privilege either one. And when we thought about use potential of ethanol, globally speaking, we can use SAF as an example, even though it's just 2 or 3% of the emissions. It's a sector that, by definition, has a willingness to pay and the education to acknowledge the importance of incentivizing the reduction of emissions. If we're talking about volume, if we think the mandates for use and footprint reduction, and it's going to be SAF because there's no other alternative for the sector at the short or mid-range. If we're talking about 2030, if we're going to comply with the mandates that were already placed on the United States and Europe, we would be talking, if 25% of these mandates were attended by the technology that's called alpha project, we will be talking about something about 9 to 10 billion liters. The United States produces 50 in corn. Brazil produces 30 in sugarcane. So we would already be talking about a very relevant volume in global production of ethanol. So there isn't really a competition between Brazil and the United States in the production of sugarcane. I'm just talking about SAF. If we're talking about petrochemicals for ethanol, we're talking about 2%. We're talking about another 10 billion liters if we can cross the barrier of the use of ethanol for marine fuel. And we already have ships, flag ships that are in test. We're talking about another 10 billion liters. So demand is not a problem, it's an opportunity, and one that we can sequence time-wise in what's available and what will remain, as it was said before. So we use today ethanol in Brazilian's fleet, which has a huge impact in the Brazilian matrix. It's 20% of the matrix, 1% of the territory contributes to our matrix to be one of the cleanest in the world, and we are advancing to use ethanol in other uses in what we call hard probate sector. So we have an incredible opportunity that talks a lot about a word that was mentioned here, which is the word transition. At the end of the COP, there was a huge discussion about the word transition. That discussion doesn't exist. It's a transition. There's no way to solve it overnight. You can't just electrify everything at once. In the case of airplanes, the technology doesn't even exist yet. Hydrogen is going to take a while, so we have to think transition, and we have to weigh of the best way to sequence this, the most efficient way, so that countries that have the highest competitive edge can produce, and the ones that don't have such an edge, at least when we talk about decarbonization, consume these products and especially pay for them in the right way. So we really create then a virtuous cycle of decarbonization. Sometimes we joke, but if we were the oil industry, we should be the first sponsor of biofuels, because it's an opportunity in a non-abrupt manner to transition the matrix to the blending, which is another important thing with these fuels, because the infrastructure exists. It's the same cars The planes will be practically the same. The ships will be practically the same. And then we allow the oil industry to undertake a more organized transition, less dramatic. So we have a very optimistic view of potential of cooperation between Brazil and the United States in that sense. Thank you. I wanted to keep on this theme of clean energy, but changing a little bit the focus to ask you a little bit about the issue of a climate crisis that we are living. It was said here that Brazil this year, 2024, has been having a lot of catastrophes, we can say, with floods, with fires, forest fires. The United States, of course, has its own climate issues. I would like to ask you, how can clean energy be a preponderant factor in the mitigation or reduction of these issues, please? Thank you for the invitation. I don't speak a lot of Portuguese. I'm going to speak in English.
A favor to all of you by speaking English. I want to go through some of the things that I'm an energy specialist. I work, I'm now a researcher and a professor at Columbia University, but I spent most of my career in the financial sector, and I had the honor as well to be the chairwoman of a refining company that is based in Houston. And so when we talk about climate change and the impact of climate change on extreme weather events, I think there's a lot the U.S. And Brazil can learn from each other about how companies deal with these kinds of weather events. In sustainability reports of any company, you not only have to show your Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions, but from the point of view of the financial sector and the credit implications of climate change, you actually have to show how is it that you're adapting to the impact on your physical assets of climate change. So there is a learning process taking place, and the U.S. Unfortunately has been exposed to many hurricanes, many types of floods, extreme weather events, and fires, and this is something that is going to be much more common, unfortunately, because given the sense of urgency, but the fact of the matter is that we're not there yet. And so just cooperation in terms of how to future-proof physical assets and energy assets in particular has been, I think, something the U.S. has had to deal with just because of where the refining energy assets have been and how to, after weather events, very rapidly have this come back. I think that's an area of future cooperation, an area where corporates and governments are going to have to be much better at, and how to think about future assets so that they're not stranded. Stranded assets is not only about assets where the products are no longer needed. Stranded assets are also about assets that cannot come back after extreme weather events. And so thinking about investments in that light, future-proofing from the point of view of sustainability, but future-proofing from the point of view of extreme weather events, I think is an untapped area of cooperation and expertise that the two countries that are obviously experiencing weather events like the ones seen in Brazil and the U.S. But if I can have two other points that I want to make. The energy transition is energy intensive. The energy transition itself generates loops of higher energy demand. What that means is that when we talk about how much investments we need, we forget that it's not only about the quantity, it's about how that means from a relative perspective, from an economic perspective. And what that means is that more or less the world invests 3% of GDP on energy. We now have to scale that to 4 or 5% of GDP in energy. That means reallocating a lot of resources from other places to energy. This is not just about whether the oil and gas sector is investing in renewables. That's just a minor part of the reallocation of capital that needs to take place. This is about creating other kinds of business models, business opportunities, and I think that's where Brazil and the US have a lot of similarities. These are very diversified economies where you know that our energy rich is a blessing to be such an energy powerhouse from the point of view of the US and from the point of view of Brazil. And it's because it's not only about the users of energy, but the consumers of energy. Brazil also has the consumers of energy in front of it. So it's about industry, it's about transportation, it's about building, so hard to abate sectors. So you're creating solutions that are homegrown. Not a lot of countries have that benefit of being not only producers of energy, but consumers of energy, so that a lot of the pilots, a lot of the innovation, a lot of the different financing vehicles can actually flourish. Because, and I've said this in other panels, the energy transition is about deglobalization of energy markets. I don't know if we have understood what that means. 80% of our primary energy requirements are in fossil fuels. In the future, and most of that, a lot of that is traded. For example, oil is 60 to 70% of all the oil consumed is traded. So we are disrupting that sector and bringing all of the energy back home. So we have to rethink the way we export energy. I think to a lot of people's point here, because how do you compete in the energy transition world? You cannot export energy directly. You need to export energy through products, low carbon intensity products. So that means such a different way to think about regulation, about business, about how you organize society. So, so there's a lot that can be done, but I think the US and Brazil, both because of the sheer magnitude of how energy intensive they are, or the fact that they're such an energy powerhouse, but that they also have, they're competitive in the sectors that are going to be energy, that are hard to abate. They provide a fantastic lab for innovation.
Obrigado, Luiz. Abraão, voltando a você.
Thank you, Abraham. Going back to you and mentioning, talking about the investment issue, and when you talk about regulation, I'd like to ask you where are the bottlenecks to increase bilateral investment in this area of energy transition? Is it in regulation? For instance, does Brazil need to accelerate change of rules for hydrogen, green hydrogen, wind, offshore? How do you see this point? Well, first, I think it's worth reinforcing that Brazil has already been a great attractor of foreign investment in renewables. That's a piece of data that says between 2015 and 22, Brazil was a developing economy that received the most foreign investment in that area, around $115 billion. Of course, $115 billion and the magnitude we're talking about of investment, necessary investments, is still too small a fraction. That points then to the size of the opportunity that Brazil shows for this type of investment and positioning in energy transition. And the regulatory side, when you think how you can increase that attraction capacity of Brazil, of course, regulations are basic. They give you predictability, so that give you the size of the market for adequate development. So I think Brazil has been doing work in that direction. We had the approval of the clean fuel, and now there's several projects that are being discussed in the Brazilian Senate, but there is a long path to the adequate implementations for all the necessary adjustments so that these rules could generate the necessary incentives to develop demand and consequently generate the offer that will enables us to attract these investments. Besides the regulation framework, of course, the business environment in Brazil, of course, is key to give the necessary attractiveness for these investments to start flowing in. And I think it's valid what was said here earlier, that Brazil has been attracting a lot of these resources. We already see American investments coming in the technology area, a few in the critical minerals and clean energy, but still in a space that needs to be better occupied. So again, I think there's work to be done by the Brazilian government with the American government and and the private sector of both countries to better leverage these opportunities. Thanks, Abrão. Tomazoni, back to you. About something you said, your initial speech about that a food system should require about $300 to $350 billion per annum up to 2030. I would like to ask you, just to reinforce this point, where's the money going to come from? This part of the financing, is it a problem when we talk about hunger, fighting hunger? As I said, only 4% of the investments today go to fight in the climate change fight, go to food and food system. That's where it goes, where's a priority, where you put that money. We know that these food systems and agricultural systems can capture up to 24% globally of the emissions. So it's tremendous potential. They could fight hunger, food insecurity. They can be a factor for energy security. It was just said here, remarked here, we have to acknowledge the importance of the system. That is why when we talk about prioritizing the amount of money is one thing. The second one is how that has to be accessible in order to implement change. And that's when I go back. You have to go to the small farmer in the land, and we have to acknowledge the value of ecosystem services. I think the world has to acknowledge that, and small farmers have a relevant role in this climate change. And that it could come via carbon credits, payment of ecosystem services, and it could come as well from us prioritizing investments where it is important to prioritize in order to fight the factors I mentioned already, which are climate factors and the issue of food insecurity. Mary, going back to you. Late last year, Petrobras informed that it had signed a contract to produce biofuel for aviation and renewable biofuels, and a contract with Honeywell. How can these initiatives be enlarged? Or widened? How do you see this perspective of more joint business, for instance, between Honeywell and Brazilian companies?
Petrobras and the investment that Petrobras is making is, I think, representative of the opportunities to combine low-cost and low-carbon feedstocks, whether it's fats, oils, greases, ethanol, biomass that is plentiful within Brazil. You take that and you combine it with a refining infrastructure like a Petrobras has, to leverage existing facilities to lower the capex to produce very cost-effective renewable fuels. That is the model that is going to accelerate what are currently relatively small co-processing or eco-fining renewable fuels projects. Those investments today are in the tens of thousands of barrels per day. The target needs to be hundreds and then ultimately millions of barrels a day. So if you just think about aviation fuel today globally, 6 million barrels a day, 7 million barrels a day of consumption, we're not going to get there 10,000 barrels at a time. But you made an excellent point about ethanol availability in Brazil and sugarcane, second crop corn in Brazil. With or without carbon capture is just it's a world-class low carbon intensity resource that should be able to fuel a significant investment in SAF for Brazil domestic and then Brazil as an exporter.
Obrigado, Barry. Paula, falamos aqui das oportunidades, né, mas eu queria te perguntar também sobre os desafios que ainda existem no mercado internacional para o enquadramento do etanol como biocombustível, né? Até que ponto essa competição com a produção de alimentos é um impeditivo maior ao desenvolvimento do etanol? Já falamos anteriormente, mas queria...
This is an obstacle. Great question. I can give you some numbers to illustrate our sugarcane ethanol already qualifies under the existing rules for aviation. Today, without any carbon capture, the first generation already ensures 60% reduction in footprint, carbon footprint. If we talk about G2 with a smaller footprint that does not compete with food, we would be able to arrive to over 70% of reduction. We have the possibility to use ethanol as a blend or as an alternative in marine fuel. So the opportunities are here, the demand is here, and certainly the offer is the great challenge in this case. And even then, we are facing very big obstacles when we come to the United States or go to Europe to champion the use of ethanol. And part of this challenge is to show how the math has to be done. And why am I mentioning that? Because Brazil is a country with tropical agriculture that is fundamentally more efficient than agriculture of temperate climates. And this efficiency is translated in a smaller footprint when we do the numbers right. Soil use reduces the intensity, so competition with food is smaller, so it's important that the international metrics, whether we want it or not, were intellectually produced in the global north, reflect in a correct way our subtropical realities. And just with that, we will be able to calculate better what is the reduction in footprint that this is affording, and we will be duly remunerated for that. We, B20, we had a new matrix, we connected with G20, the same point that you talked about.
Da importância da gente garantir o funding, da importância da gente garantir a remuneração desses
of the recovery of all these investments. So we're very close to the financing work group, sustainable investments. So this reduction in the footprint must be done, and we need the mechanisms for remuneration. Brazil has very important regulation initiatives. We have very practical models. We're advancing in approving the carbon footprint standards, and these things have to be aligned. There has to be convergence, there has to be consistent metrics, so that we can overcome the challenges and get investments. Without investments, there won't be renewable products, so we have to close these gaps in a concrete fashion. One last question. Could you use your power of synthesizing and talk about green hydrogen, please? Green hydrogen has been mentioned as a source of great energy potential. What are the chances of Brazil and the U.S. cooperating in this, either on the industrial space or in other areas?
Where the oil and gas sector is actually very useful. The most important consumers of hydrogen today are refineries. Both Brazil and the U.S. are very, very efficient producers of oil and gas, but really have a very important refining park. And also, they're both huge agricultural producers. And that is another of the outlets of hydrogen or potentially green hydrogen, because eventually you do use natural gas for fertilizers. So knowing that, I think I think the oil industry in the US and Petrobras, which is already investing in these kinds of blue hydrogen and green hydrogen, there is the ability to be the procurement. You need to create markets. And one of the most relevant issues for financing the energy transition is the bankability of projects. There are already off-takers. Oil and gas, Petrobras, national companies are already natural off-takers of hydrogen because they consume hydrogen. And so that, to me, is a clear pathway in which both countries can develop blue hydrogen and even green hydrogen. There are national companies as well that are trying, even though they are investing in oil and gas, They are trying to also develop green hydrogen pilot projects through their refining, because a lot of what the energy transition is industrialization. So the commodity aspect of oil and gas is going to go away. The industrialization part of refining, then converting themselves into renewable diesel, and so going into renewable fuels, or converting themselves in low carbon fuels, or merging into what will be the only thing that we have more clarity about in the horizon, which is the chemical and petrochemical. And so that is the ultimate demand in 2050s in chemicals. And so you want to start thinking about how is it that you're going to decarbonize the whole value chain, and green hydrogen is such an important part of it. And both countries are actually doing a lot of green hydrogen projects based on public policy and certainty of public policy in the future. One has a more huge balance sheet, and so it's putting a lot of more of carrots. But I think Brazil, from the public policy framework that it has for green hydrogen, I think it's probably one of the best in emerging markets. So I am very excited to see. I know the technology is not yet commercial, but I am actually optimistic that if it's going to be solved, it's going to be solved in these two countries.
Obrigado, Luísa. Bem, e dessa forma terminamos o painel. Vamos para o próximo agora. Obrigado a todos.
On to our next panel. Thank you very much.
Alô. Obrigada, Chico, pela mediação.
Thank you, Chico, for moderating. Thank you for the panel. Excellent panel.
Unveil the splendor of Brazil's nature. It's spectacular. It's for you.
Febraban. Somos um espaço de encontro que amplia o diálogo, acolhe diferentes pontos de vista, provoca novos olhares. Existimos para conectar os bancos com você. Conectamos para fortalecer a economia, o Brasil. Febraban, dialogar para convergir, para transformar.
Moving along, this is the last panel, Power Shoring Opportunities for Investment in Energy. It's a great pleasure to invite Marcel Correa, coordinator for Valor Econômico in Brasilia, to moderate this event. Marcel, you have the floor. Good morning. I'd like to invite, but by the way, it's a pleasure to be here and to have heard all the previous panels. I'd like to call up Gabriel Santamaria from Banco do Brasil, responsible for sustainable development, Jorge Abash from the University of Brazil. He teaches economics. Luciana Costa, Director of Infrastructure and Energy Transition from the Brazilian National Development Bank. Marcos Peigo from the Scala Data Center. And Marina Marçal, a specialist in climate policy. Thank you. I'd like to begin talking about this concept of offshoring. We've heard the word a little bit in the other panels. It was coined by Georges Abad, who's here with us. Power shoring, I'm sorry. It's the idea of decentralizing production in a clean, abundant, and cheap manner. 2 data points. $96 billion of investments over the next 5 years, and a generation of over $300 billion in Brazilian exports over the next decade. So this decentralization will benefit Brazil. So let's start with Georgie. Since you started writing about this and identifying this tendency, how has this panorama of investments evolved? Where is it now, and what are the prospects for Brazil? Thank you, Valor. Thank you, Alexandre, for the invitation. Power shoring is now part of the investment scenario, and even on Wall Street, they're increasingly talking about this. If you read the business pages, if you go on Google, you'll see this idea that Marcel is talking about. That it's a corporative idea of localizing production where there's abundant, cheap, and secure green energy. And in Brazil, that coincides with water a lot of times, where there is intensive investments in energy, normally there are high levels of water consumptions, but Brazil also has critical minerals. It has a potentially great carbon market, critical minerals, etc., and a huge rainforest. All of this puts Brazil in a very special position to be part of the global decarbonization agenda at a very low cost and very attractive in a very attractive manner in very short amount of time, because we already have a green grid that's very green and that depends on this energy. And in this sense, Brazil can be an ally, a valuable ally to the U.S. for these energy-intensive investments that need to lower the carbon footprint at a low cost. So what are we seeing? If we look, for example, at the foreign investment data from last year, entities that mapped this data, you'll see that the amount of investments that entered Brazil for greenfield projects that are anchored in the area of energy has grown substantially. If you look at the first 6 months of this year, the same thing has happened at even a higher rate. If we look at investments here, Luciana is here, Gabriel from the Banco do Brasil are here, and there's also representatives from the Brazilian National Development Bank. They're on the front line for identifying projects, and what you'll see is that there is an increasing number of interested parties who are looking for these solutions and who are actually investing today. This is in various spaces, all of them associated with the decarbonization, areas that need decarbonization, that are very energy intensive. And these are very attractive projects. I wanted to now hear from Luciana and Gabriel. Are the public banks well positioned? Luciana, what is the strategy for the Brazilian National Development Bank in this sense? And can you tell us about what is the appetite of investors for projects that have as their focus energy transition? Thank you to everybody. Thank you, Marcelo, for the invitation. And I want to greet my colleagues here on the panel. The Brazilian National Development Bank is the largest investor in renewable energy in the world. We are leaders. For decades, we've been leaders. So we're a bank that has expertise and know-how to finance energy transition projects. Brazil has the energy grid and the potential for power shoring. Why? Because the country had the right public policies over the last decades, and because the Brazilian National Development Bank was there to help finance these projects. If Brazil hadn't financed these projects like hydroelectrics when they needed to be financing wind and solar projects, when Brazil scaled up these projects, we would not be where we are now, financing the transmission lines, etc. So what do we see as the future? Now we need to scale up these new technologies. We need to scale up green hydrogen, sustainable jet fuel, biobunker, green steel, and green fertilizers. So we have a pipeline of approximately $40 billion of green hydrogen projects that where we haven't taken a final decision, but these are projects that we've been accompanying carefully and that will come to fruition, we hope. We've already financed biomethane. We've already financed a little bit under 700 million in the biomethane space. We have green fertilizer projects, advanced fuel projects. Our next step is to finance these upcoming technologies. Brazil has great potential as far as biomass, critical minerals, energy grid, and renewable energy. 13% of the world's water, as was mentioned, is in Brazil, the largest rainforest in the world. Great potential for finding solutions in nature. So what is impeding Brazil from bringing these to market? It's capital. So these are basically projects that require intensive capital investments, but we also have to consider the capital. We have to consider the capital cost. Brazil is still not an investment-grade country. Our local interest rate is very high. Moving forward, the Brazilian National Development Bank has an instrument, which is the Climate Fund, which allows, by the way, this entity is fed by resources whose origin come from the Treasury. The Treasury, it emits green bonds, and this helps us finance these projects, but these rates are rates established by the Treasury. So we blend these resources to help finance projects for the energy transition. This reformulated the fund, the Climate Fund. Before, it was fed only with budget funds, and budget funds have their limits. So the bank has tried to make some of these projects viable with more competitive funding. 85% of the resources from our bank doesn't have subsidies. So these investments are fighting with projects from other countries that have great subsidies, like the U.S. and Europe are heavily subsidized. Their projects are heavily subsidized. So power shoring is an important concept, but in Brazil it moves slower because of this global competition, because other countries raise barriers, and also because our cost of capital is higher. We can enter into more detail about that soon, but Gabriel, how is your bank positioned for the transition? What is their portfolio? What is their strategy? Thank you, Marcelo. Good morning, everybody, first of all. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here on this panel with my colleagues to talk about such an important theme, important for Brazil and Banco do Brasil. Marcel, you said And not only Banco do Brasil, but this financial sector as a whole has a fundamental role to push forward these transitions. We can direct this capital flow to these green economy projects and these decarbonization projects. Banco do Brasil that is very much the case. We have over $1 trillion reais in portfolio. Much of that is directed toward business that have a positive socio-environmental impact. When we look at renewable energy and energy transition, more than 15 billion in our portfolio, that's almost 40% of growth over the last 2 years. So that is a sign of the strong appetite there is for these projects. Our goal is to get to 30 billion by 2030. So this is a space that we've really invested in. Also trying to invest in many solutions in different sectors. Solutions on the wholesale side. 8 billion of this is directed toward large-scale projects, as was mentioned by the BNDES, but also we also invest in small, medium, and large corporations and retail. So there is an appetite. I think the bank is well positioned in this space, and we seek opportunities to contribute to this transition. Another important point, when we look at the decarbonization agenda, recent studies show that more than 50% of the large corporations are committed to be carbon neutral by 2050. That shows that they are going to have to enter into this agenda. Other studies show the speed and the necessity of investments to get to this point over the next 3 decades. And this will generate 100 to 150 trillion. And so we have to contribute to that agenda and will make businesses very competitive. That's why we're well positioned in this space, not only this space but others, and we're going to try to support Brazil in this initiative. There are hundreds of opportunities. I know we've heard so much about that all morning long. Marina, how can we take advantage? Another key word we've heard is the fair transition. How can we take advantage of this investment potential to make a difference in people's lives, in urban centers? Because at the end of the day, that is what makes the difference. How do you see this, Marina? Thank you, Marcelo, for the invitation. Thank you, Catarina. This panel really comes at such a timely moment. We're seeing all the impacts of these climate crises, the flooding, the wildfires. I'm shocked by what I read, what I see in the news, all the fires, and so these crises they affect our grid, our energy grid. Yes, our grid is very clean. We have a huge percentage of our energy that is renewable, but we can't depend only on the hydroelectric front. We have to have these kind of discussions. But with that, I think it's extremely important for us to analyze something that I think hasn't been raised by anybody in any of the panels, and I want to highlight this. What is the role of the cities? Everyone who spoke about energy transition up until now, we've always looked at the corporate responsibility of the banks and the responsibility of the federal government. Cities, a study by the UN says that they're responsible for 78% of the energy production and 60% of the greenhouse gases. So we can't ignore this. If we ignore the role of cities, we're really losing an opportunity. We're missing an opportunity to advance this agenda during this decade of climate crises. Efforts obviously have not been enough to deal with the changes in Brazil, so we have to accelerate these changes. So we have to look at the city. I think it's extremely important. Brazil will be hosting COP30 in Belém in the Amazon. 80% of the Amazon's population, to give you an idea, live in urban centers. That goes against that image that the global north has that the Amazon is uninhabited. And that's why I think this agenda is so important. I'm not an expert in climate change, but I do participate in projects that try to work on the urban agenda vis-a-vis the federal government, and we try to highlight how cities can help. Next year, next year the Paris Accord will celebrate 10 years since it was signed, and countries will have to define their contributions. And a lot of countries don't look at their urban elements. So one of the goals is if these countries could look more toward the urban sector, the urban contributions, and how cities can help on a strategic level. Just to give you an idea, we're working with the mobility and transportation sector, especially and in the solid waste sectors. I was talking to my colleague here. We have to look at the role of the recyclables, and that has an urban element, and that conversation has to be had with mayors. The transportation, urban transportation, that is the jurisdiction of mayors. I work with Urba 20, which is an entity that gathers the mayors to have a role in the G20. So first, they're talking about social inclusion, and we have to prioritize climate investments so cities can accelerate these implementations that will generate jobs and improve conditions. So we need financing from banks. We need renewable investments and subsidies. And the third priority is to reform the global financing system. Often they don't, they will finance some projects to the detriment of others. So I think there's a lot of opportunities. If we look at the transition, energy transition from the optics of justice, we are in an election cycle in the U.S. Many mayors will be elected 2 weeks before, and many of the U.S. mayors will be coming to our event in Brazil. And we also have municipal elections in Brazil, so it's very important to share the importance of mayors and cities toward a just energy transition. Marcos Pego. We heard about opportunities and potentials, and we heard about the scale of data centers. How can a data center company, you need access to energy and to clean energy and abundant energy. And you have, how does that enter the negotiations in your business? Thank you for the question. Thank you to everybody. I don't know if being the last speaker in the last panel is good or bad, but let's talk about scale. And Gabriel is a partner of ours. We heard in the 4 panels, many panel members spoke, almost didn't speak about technology, didn't speak about AI. The data center industry seems like a villain, right? Because we are a great consumer of energy. We consume 2 to 3% of global energies, and with the AI evolutions, our projections are that can reach 5 to 6%. Some analysts says 10. I wish it were, because that would mean our industry would be gigantic. But we can look at that from a negative side, but we can't forget the positive side. The industry, which is this great consumer of energy, is an industry with a high level of awareness vis-a-vis their responsibility with sustainability. When we think about the great companies that move our world, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Meta, and others, all of them have public commitments to decarbonizing and sustainability. They are the engine that generate consumption, innovation. They create the applications in our day-to-day life. So the use of AI is of fundamental importance to all industries, including for decarbonization strategies, creation of new fuels. It's impossible to think anything in our world that won't intensively use technology and AI. So this is a great opportunity to have an industry that grows at a fast rhythm. We're growing. We began with at 17 megawatts, now over 200, and we'll close the year at 450. And in 4 years, we'll be the fourth or fifth to the leader in Latin America. We have a footprint in 4 countries, investments in the billions of dollars, and we have over $5 billion of investment commitments. That's only one company. When we think of this, and when we think of Brazil, that's when we become happy, and that's when power shoring is so relevant. And we are looking at a very complex equation that could have very bad consequences for us, as a matter of fact, in generating energy. All investments put us in an enviable position in the Northern Virginia region, which is the heart and the lung of data centers of the world. There's a lack. 4 to 6 gigawatts are missing. The Dominion company put it out an ad 2 or 3 months ago that any new connection of 100 megawatts above will take 7 or 8 years. So the growth of the market, the infrastructure market, can't wait. The demand is for now, and that's where Brazil comes in.
While we have this lack in Brazil, we have a big superavid that can be used. We also control almost 2 gig installed capacity, and we talk about the issue of sustainability. I agree with you, but there's a factor that comes with this, that is certainty of the top line. Now we have revenue certainty, which solves the equation of lacking in our states, surplus in Brazil, in production, also in generation. That's the danger that we have. We already produce today with what we have installed and what is being installed and will be installed next year. More energy than we have, more consumer market in Brazil. So when you have a surplus, prices go down, and then the ROI goes down, and then investor stops investing. It's that simple. And so if we join everything, there's only one piece missing that makes Brazil a global powerhouse, and then the great energy exporter with high added value, as our panelists were saying before, which is exactly to be able to receive in Brazil data centers that not only will process data, collect data, and process information. Data centers are places where data torture until they confess, not only doing this locally in Latin American data, but also European and North American data that could be processed within the Brazilian territory. For that, regulation is key, so we can't start to speculate in the regulation sector with regulation that restricts investment. We have a PL 238 in the Senate that was born as very restrictive, making Brazil the worst place to invest in AI in the world. So we have to be more pragmatic. We have to open in the Senate. It's support of several governors, municipalities, the stakeholders, and they're interested in receiving these investments, and we are sure that we're going to have regulation that will allow the development of AI in Brazil efficiently, but we have a larger discussion of how to regulate power shoring, but via data center. How can we create a regulatory environment with data that are not local data, not protected by our data protection, sovereignty laws that can process foreign data? Is thinking almost a concept to create embassy for data. Imagine that in certain places you can bring data from the origin country, process laws within that country, and give it back. With that, Brazil, and talking about numbers, which is always good, when we think about the market projected by AI creation of data centers, considering only local development, we're talking about a market that today in Brazil is 800 megawatts, could go up to 3 gig. That will be an investment in the order of $2.22 billion in direct investments in the data center industry. Multiply that by 3 when we consider generation and transmission. We talk about fraction of the growth of data centers that globally that we could capture within Brazil. Within this concept, we go from 3 to 8, 11. Another 8, 11% total what's on the table now, and the most important is speed. Today, these energy contingencies in the world will be resolved with a lot of investment, cheaper capital, more favorable regulatory framework. If we miss this wave, we're going to miss another opportunity to make Brazil a leader in one industry that grows the most. So as an entrepreneur, we look at the future, but we capture the present opportunities. I'm not seeing the country doing that right now. That is a junction of government, legislative, executive, the investor, the entrepreneur, and the nation as a whole, represented by the massive generation of jobs and growth that this industry could do. Thank you, Marcio. Time watch is rolling. I'd like you to please try to synthesize. I wouldn't like to let this conversation go without bringing to our circle another issue that was mentioned, which is reduction in hydrogen. Landmark and also other for the future. You showed us certain interests of certain clients in the hydrogen. If we create a regulatory market accessing this new and facilitates, or is there still not a bottleneck in that regulation? How do you see that in practice? Actually, it was great. The new PL of the green hydrogen Brazil. Energy transitions presupposes the creation of a new regulation framework. It has to evolve because there's a risks that capital are not going to run. Capital is not going to run regulation risks. So the world started looking at Brazil as a big hub for green hydrogen. We have several initiatives, green fertilizer for export, even this world of, we have to have the ambition to export energy-intensive products with low carbon content, but without regulation, investments will not flow, and then doesn't matter if we have revenue or not, or capital, some regulation risks, capital cannot run. So the approval of this PL came in at a good time. Brazil actually, as this window of opportunity that the country has for power shoring and data centers, is an important emblematic case for offshore. Brazil has been in attract investments in data centers, even without regulation. There are some cases of countries that have been attracting data centers that could attract a lot more if we have a regulation that is more streamlined. We could attract even more. And for instance, green hydrogen, if we don't know what is green hydrogen, who regulates it, what content, what is the carbon content in the hydrogen? What kind of energy will it utilize? Can you pull it off the grid or not? There's this kind of definition. Without this kind of definition, investment will not flow. So this PL came at a good time, and there are others that we need to advance. And the PL for the carbon regulation market is one that is stuck, but it's one that is very important to make investments come in for nature-based solutions, other investments that need to start flowing. So I agree with you. We need to keep evolving in regulation. I wanted to hear from George. We were at a Brazil-United States forum celebrating this relationship between these two countries as well. What are these opportunities? We talk about power sharing between these two economies. What are the strategies to present these opportunities of this offer of clean energy? Discussing and promoting this dialogue, binational dialogue, and how do you see the Brazil position internationally, how to sell this availability, and if you can explain the process. No, thank you. If you use the data of all the commitments that U.S. has for investment, for subsidize their electric matrix, they only will have the green matrix that Brazil has today in 29 years. 29. That if they follow the commitments and contracts. To give you an idea of how Brazil has a window of opportunity to negotiate with the United States, offering what? Space for investments, energy-intensive companies, as I said before, that need to decarbonize and have access to cheap and safe energy, so that the United States can compete in a green agenda. They have to offer brutal subsidies. They have to discriminate, and they have to protect. Brazil doesn't need these subsidies except to some startups. Doesn't need to discriminate or protect. On the contrary, it's in Brazil's best interest today that the international trade in green products be the most free and liberal possible. Brazil has only to win, and alongside Brazil will win everybody who invests here, add value, benefiting from all these conditions that we already discussed, and help the world decarbonize in a better price and faster. So the United States should consider extending the IRA for American companies, case by case, for American companies that need to decarbonize in the short run at attractive prices. That is also good for the United States because the course of the IRA, you already know, it's brutal and has an impact on the public debt with several direct and indirect consequences. So, in fact, Brazil can be a great ally of the United States due to all these different transmission channels. I think that, and something else, we have to take into account that the biggest business agenda that we know is the green agenda. The most pessimist calculations indicate that until 2050 we'll need at least $100 trillion in new investments throughout the world. So we talk a lot about the geopolitical issues, etc. What is really at play is who is going to occupy this space, not as a consumer of green products and technologies, but as a producer of these green products, development of these technologies, royalties, services, and everything else that will reposition countries in the world. It's impossible to talk about decarbonization and food insecurity without talking about Brazil. But to understand where Brazil can get with the green agenda and decarbonization agenda, as well as food security agenda, and not only use that to leverage reduction of hunger and poverty, but also the companies that have long forward and backward chains that generate a lot of revenues and jobs and export. This is probably the main tool to solve the problems of our super swollen cities, our population. Not everybody remembers that Brazil has one of the most urban in the world. 86% of our population is urban, so we need to use our competitive edges, which is everything that we already mentioned, to industrialize all that we have a surplus on, and with the prices vis-a-vis the price of water, critical minerals, everything, the market price is going up, but I need to use this as an instrument to gain bargaining power in negotiation tables so that we can reduce the price and terms favoring vis-a-vis the others. And to create a more harmonic country. I think that is all within reach, and it's in the interest of the United States, and also to look for the best alliances that will favor everybody. Thank you. Gabriel, I'd like to hear you. Marina raised an issue like how the climate issue in Brazil as a whole, how that affects the image of Brazil around the world. And also, there's a tradition of to finance agribusiness. What is the strategy, main measures of Banco do Brasil, so that agribusiness can be more and more sustainable in Brazil? How that collaborates as well to consolidate this image of Brazil as a green, sustainable economy? How do you see that? Thanks, Marcelo. Share here that three main measures that are developed by the Banco do Brasil, I think, that contribute so that we can have a low carbon sustainable agribusiness, but with the agenda of the power sharing. I think the first of them is to look for, there's a lot of money on the table, so let's try to capture these resources out there when we look at these sectors that are considered green, such as low carbon, sustainable agriculture, even renewables. We can get to these agreements. For instance, Morgan here from BID that supported us in one of these captures too. As a financial institution, bring this to a different negotiated position. I think that is good for states and municipalities to bring inadequate finances, terms for higher discounts, and that is just for agribusiness to deliver at the point. Also bring these resources to give higher discounts for projects of renewable energy that are sustainable today for big companies. If you go to the bank, we already have a different rating or ranking. You have a discount, and so that's one real quick. The second one, our salespeople and our staff knowing what is the moment when I can offer that to my clients. So we use, just to give you a little example, we use a little AI to see who the clients were to have the train to migrate to renewables that have roof availability, have an account of a certain amount to push that. This is something, this specialization in customer service here, whether for agriculture or other sectors, we have been exploring more and more. Just to add, we have today a bioeconomy hub installed in the city of Belém just for small farmers, just to drive that chain, and we grew 100% in 6 months. So we saw that that's 1.5 in portfolio. So that has been bringing results. And the third, we have to be open for new business models. We have more connected business to our forum, but there's a great opportunity to bring new revenue for the bank, but also to support our clients. So we are already in the carbon market today, doing the different things. So the bank maybe at some point can start a trade in renewable for clients that maybe are still unable to implement in their industry. So these are a few ways that we have been driving this and experimenting that I think can contribute with this portfolio. Okay, our time is almost up. I'd like to ask Marina the last question. We have a calendar of forum of the civil society. We're looking at the perspective of investment. What is the role of civil society to present this possibility of Brazil as an economy can also export this energy? How do you see this possibility also in the reduction of inequality and gender and race. Regionally, I'd like to hear you on that too, if possible. I know we're speeding here. I think that looking at a civil society as a whole, and I was talking about legislative processes, and a part of the environmental Congress panel is to monitor so that this happens. And now, connecting that to fair energy transition, I think we have a shameful fact that Brazil has thousands of municipalities. We only have 23 cities that have climate action plans. I think that is dire, extremely dire, and shows how much we have to advance to have plans at Nivel City so that we can have projects that could, in fact, connect the energy extraction agenda with fair energy. I have an example here. We work in the CPIC 40, which exactly connects energy and justice. We have a project in Colombia called La Golita, that's to empower women to be bus drivers, so we can understand this issue of energy transition with the question of gender and race. When I worked in the City Hall Rio de Janeiro, I created a project. So when we look at the importance of financing cities to have climate action plans, 23 cities, I think that's terrible. I'm talking to the federal government to try and accelerate that. We're going to give our support to have more mitigation adaptation processes that has been a focus of the government at the federal level. So we need to look at these plans to have projects such as the one I mentioned that connect energy transition agendas with gender and race, especially anticipating that Brazil intends to work the COP 30 with the item of fair energy transition. So I leave the invitation here to participate with us in November to collaborate with the city halls to advance this issue of fair energy transition. Thank you. Unfortunately, our time is up. I would like to talk to you all day. I'd like to thank you all for the conversation. I wish everybody a good day. Thank you, Marcelo, panelists. Excellent dialogue. How's this?
Bom, com esse último debate, a gente se encaminha aqui para a parte final do evento.
Now we're going to the final part of our event. Thank you. Before, I'd like to give the floor to close our super productive morning, Rachel Maia, President of the Managing Council of the UN Global Pact Network Brazil, to give us her inspired words as usual. First, thank you for the opportunity to conclude this. Valor and Amcham is something special. Amcham, and I am recurrent over there. So thank you. But beyond the greeting, before doing a description, Rachel Meyer, a black woman, 1.83 m with low shoes right now. But beyond thanking and beyond Fernandinha of raising issues such as carbon footprint, talking about critical mineral agenda, talking about the importance that we are a silo with ample resources in copper, lithium, talking about other natural resources that we have, nickel. also bringing the importance of government and the entrepreneurial sector, how they have been bringing the difficulties and bureaucracy to the table, trying to resolve these bottlenecks, important points to debureaucratize, and beyond debureaucratizing, lower costs, because we need to be a viable country. These 2 weeks now, I just spoke to Manuel. We are here, Brazil, to raise resources, to bring investors back. So invest like today or to yesterday, Brazil Climate Summit and so on. So we need to more and more invite potential investors. We can't just be talking to our audience. We already have our audience. That's the main point here. Right, advisor? It's important. But one of the important pillars that we cannot forget is the pillar of sustainability. Talk about transition, sustainability is contained within that. Many people believe that it's only the environmental impact that is contained. No, the social impact is already contained. We need to talk about the small and mid-sized entrepreneurs. They are critically important for the carbon footprint issues. They need to be seen. That is key. Otherwise, we'll be talking to the same audience, and they don't have the conditions to come here to New York. They don't have the conditions to be sitting here in all these conventions and conferences such as this one. So it is impossible to bring this agenda without bringing the social too, that is also contained in the process. So that's how I conclude. To grow until 2030, 30%, we need to understand that we need to open a little more our, to put in these wheels of several investors, Brazilian investors that we all know each other. It's interesting, right? It's an event that everybody see each other, greet each other, but we need to provoke each other a little more and bring in an approach of investors that we don't know yet. And to end, I'm going to end as Kofi Annan ended the Agenda 2030 in Paris in 2015. Nobody leaves anybody behind. We need to exercise our mindset on this every day. Thank you very much. Thank you, Valor. Thank you, Amcham. We'll see each other in about 2 hours at the Global Pact, okay? Kisses. You're laughing, of course. I'm going to advertise my little event there. Thank you, Rachel. I will also advertise the Pacto event. Stay for that event. And thank you again to Pacto for allowing us to be here at the UN, and thank you to all the panelists who were here with us. On behalf of Valor Econômico and Amcham Brasil, I'd like also to thank our sponsors that made this possible. Master sponsor Petrobras, Scala Data Center, JBS, Banco do Brasil, Embratur, support of the government of the state of Rio de Janeiro, FEBRABAN, Apex Brazil, Ministry of Development, Industry, Commerce and Services of Brazil, and the institutional support of Atlantic Council. Today's initiative is an important step in the quest for solutions, not just to respond to climate challenges, but also to promote sustainable development and economic prosperity for Brazil, the United States, and the world. This event is a lot more than a discussion forum. Is an action and collaboration platform. So the content that we saw here today and this morning that ended up being too short to discuss everything will echo in our vehicles, Valor Econômico website, the printed newspaper, Global, CBN Radio. We also have interviews and dialogues with our panelists, with the sources in the audience. You will see a lot more content and more detailed content than what you could see here in the panel today. So please join us, and let this be landmark in the construction of a better future for all of us. Thank you again on behalf of Amcham, Banco do Brasil, and thank you for all of us who are here with us remotely and the ones who came in person. Have a good afternoon, everybody. Thank you.